Chapter 72. He thinks that our days are numbered. All the details of the new county suffrage bill were settled at Matching during the recess between Mr. Monk, Phineas Finn, and a very experienced gentleman from the Treasury, one Mr. Prime, who was supposed to know more about such things than any man living, and was consequently called Constitution Charlie. He was an elderly man, over 60 years of age, who remembered the first Reform Bill, and had been engaged in the doctoring of constituencies ever since. The bill, if passed, would be mainly his bill, and yet the world would never hear his name as connected with it. Let us hope that he was comfortable at Matching, and that he found his consolation in the smiles of the Duchess. During this time the old Duke was away, and even the Prime Minister was absent for some days. He would fain have busied himself about the bill himself, but was hardly allowed by his colleagues to have any hand in framing it. The great points of the measure had of course been arranged in the Cabinet, where, however, Mr. Monk's views had been adopted almost without a change. It may not perhaps be too much to assume that one or two members of the Cabinet did not quite understand the full scope of every suggested clause. The effects which clauses will produce, the dangers which may be expected from this or that change, the manner in which this or that proposition will come out in the washing, do not strike even Cabinet ministers at a glance. A little study in a man's own Cabinet, after the reading perhaps of a few leading articles, and perhaps a short conversation with an astute friend or two, will enable a statesman to be strong at a given time for, or even, if necessary, against a measure, who has listened in silence, and has perhaps given his personal assent to the original suggestion. I doubt whether Lord Drummond, when he sat silent in the Cabinet, had realized those fears which weighed upon him so strongly afterwards, or had then foreseen that the adoption of a nearly similar franchise for the counties and boroughs must inevitably lead to the American system of numerical representation. But when time had been given him, and he and Sir Timothy had talked it all over, the mind of no man was ever clearer than that of Lord Drummond. The Prime Minister, with the diligence which belonged to him, had mastered all the details of Mr. Monk's bill before it was discussed in the Cabinet, and yet he found that his assistance was hardly needed in the absolute preparation. Had they allowed him he would have done it all himself. But it was assumed that he would not trouble himself with such work, and he perceived that he was not wanted. Nothing of moment was settled without a reference to him. He required that everything should be explained as it went on, down to the extension of every borough boundary, but he knew that he was not doing it himself, and that Mr. Monk and Constitution Charlie had the prize between them. Nor did he dare to ask Mr. Monk what would be the fate of the bill. To devote all one's time and mind and industry to a measure which one knows will fall to the ground must be sad. Work under such circumstances must be very grievous. But such is often the fate of statesmen. Whether Mr. Monk labored under such a conviction the Prime Minister did not know, though he saw his friend and colleague almost daily. In truth no one dared to tell him exactly what he thought. Even the old Duke had become partially reticent, and taken himself off to his own woods at Long Royston. To Phineas Finn the Prime Minister would sometimes say a word, but would say even that timidly. On any abstract question, such as that which he had discussed when they had been walking together, he could talk freely enough. But on the matter of the day, those affairs which were of infinite importance to himself, and on which one would suppose he would take delight in speaking to a trusted colleague, he could not bring himself to be open. "It must be a long bill, I suppose," he said to Phineas one day. "I'm afraid so, Duke. It will run, I fear, to over 100 clauses. It will take you the best part of the session to get through it. If we can have the second reading early in March, we hope to send it up to you in the first week in June. That will give us ample time." Yes, yes. I suppose so. But he did not dare to ask Phineas Finn whether he thought that the House of Commons would assent to the second reading. It was known at this time that the Prime Minister was painfully anxious as to the fate of the ministry. It seemed to be but the other day that everybody connected with the government was living in fear lest he should resign. His threats in that direction had always been made to his old friend the Duke of St. Bungay, but a great man cannot whisper his thoughts without having them carried in the air. In all the clubs it had been declared that that was the rock by which the coalition would probably be wrecked. The newspapers had repeated the story. And the People's Banner had assured the world that if it were so the Duke of Omnium would thus do for his country the only good service which it was possible that he should render it. That was at the time when Sir Orlando was mutinous and when Lopez had destroyed himself. But now no such threat came from the Duke, and the People's Banner was already accusing him of clinging to power with pertinacious and unconstitutional tenacity. Had not Sir Orlando deserted him? Was it not well known that Lord Drummond and Sir Timothy Beeswax were only restrained from doing so by a mistaken loyalty? Everybody came up to town, Mr. Monk having his bill in his pocket, and the Queen's speech was read, promising the county suffrage bill. The address was voted with a very few words from either side. The battle was not to be fought then. Indeed, the state of things was so abnormal that there could hardly be said to be any sides in the House. A stranger in the gallery, not knowing the condition of affairs, would have thought that no minister had for many years commanded so large a majority, as the crowd of members was always on the government side of the House. But the opposition which Mr. Monk expected would, he knew, come from those who sat around him, behind him, and even at his very elbow. About a week after Parliament met the bill was read for the first time, and the second reading was appointed for an early day in March. The Duke had suggested to Mr. Monk the expedience of some further delay, giving as his reason the necessity of getting through certain routine work, should the rejection of the bill create the confusion of a resignation. No one who knew the Duke could ever suspect him of giving a false reason. But it seemed that in this the Prime Minister was allowing himself to be harassed by fears of the future. Mr. Monk thought that any delay would be injurious and open to suspicion after what had been said and done, and was urgent in his arguments. The Duke gave way, but he did so almost sullenly, signifying his acquiescence with haughty silence. "I am sorry," said Mr. Monk, "to differ from your Grace, but my opinion in the matter is so strong that I do not dare to abstain from expressing it." The Duke bowed again and smiled. He had intended that the smile should be acquiescent, but it had been as cold as steel. He knew that he was misbehaving, but was not sufficiently master of his own manner to be gracious. He told himself on the spot, though he was quite wrong in so telling himself, that he had now made an enemy also of Mr. Monk, and through Mr. Monk of Phineas Finn. And now he felt that he had no friend left in whom to trust, for the old Duke had become cold and indifferent. The old Duke, he thought, was tired of his work and anxious for rest. It was the old Duke who had brought him into this hornet's nest, had fixed upon his back the unwilling load, had compelled him to assume the place which now to lose would be a disgrace, and the old Duke was now deserting him. He was sore all over, angry with everyone, ungracious even with his private secretary and his wife, and especially miserable because he was thoroughly aware of his own faults. And yet, through it all, there was present to him a desire to fight on to the very last. Let his colleagues do what they might, and say what they might, he would remain Prime Minister of England as long as he was supported by a majority of the House of Commons. "I do not know any greater step than this," Phineas said to him pleasantly one day, speaking of their new measure, towards that millennium of which we were talking at Matching. "If we can only accomplish it. Those moral speculations, Mr. Finn," he said, "will hardly bear the wear and tear of real life." The words of the answer, combined with the manner in which they were spoken, were stern and almost uncivil. Phineas, at any rate, had done nothing to offend him. The Duke paused, trying to find some expression by which he might correct the injury he had done, but, not finding any, passed on without further speech. Phineas shrugged his shoulders and went his way, telling himself that he had received one further injunction not to put his trust in princes. "We shall be beaten, certainly," said Mr. Monk to Phineas, not long afterwards. "What makes you so sure?" "I smell it in the air. I see it in men's faces. And yet it's a moderate bill." They'll have to pass something stronger before long if they throw it out now. It's not the bill that they'll reject, but us. We have served our turn, and we ought to go. The House is tired of the Duke. The Duke is so good a man that I hardly like to admit even that, but I fear it is so. He is fretful and he makes enemies. I sometimes think that he is ill. He is ill at ease and sick at heart. He cannot hide his chagrin, and then is doubly wretched because he has betrayed it. I do not know that I ever respected and, at the same time, pitied a man more thoroughly. He snubbed me awfully yesterday, said Phineas, laughing. He cannot help himself. He snubs me at every word that he speaks, and yet I believe that he is most anxious to be civil to me. His ministry has been of great service to the country. For myself, I shall never regret having joined it. But I think that to him it has been a continual sorrow. The system on which the Duchess had commenced her career as wife of the Prime Minister had now been completely abandoned. In the first place, she had herself become so weary of it that she had been unable to continue the exertion. She had, too, become in some degree ashamed of her failures. The names of Major Pountney and Mr. Lopez were not now pleasant to her ears, nor did she look back with satisfaction on the courtesies she had lavished on Sir Orlando or the smiles she had given to Sir Timothy Beeswax. "I've known a good many vulgar people in my time," she said one day to Mrs. Finn, "but none ever so vulgar as our ministerial supporters. You don't remember Mr. Bott, my dear. He was before your time, one of the arithmetical men, and a great friend of Plantagenet's. He was very bad, but there have come up worse since him. Sometimes, I think, I like a little vulgarity for a change, but, upon my honor, when we get rid of all this it will be a pleasure to go back to ladies and gentlemen." This the Duchess said in her extreme bitterness. "It seems to me that you have pretty well got rid of all this already. But I haven't got anybody else in their place. I have almost made up my mind not to ask anyone into the house for the next 12 months. I used to think that nothing would ever knock me up, but now I feel that I'm almost done for. I hardly dare open my mouth to Plantagenet. The Duke of St. Bungay has cut me. Mr. Monk looks as ominous as an owl, and your husband hasn't a word to say left. Barrington Erle hides his face and passes by when he sees me. Mr. Rattler did try to comfort me the other day by saying that everything was at 6s and 7s, and I really took it almost as a compliment to be spoken to. Don't you think Plantagenet is ill? He is careworn. A man may be worn by care till there comes to be nothing left of him. But he never speaks of giving up now. The old Bishop of St. Austell talks of resigning, and he has already made up his mind who is to have the see. He used to consult the Duke about all these things, but I don't think he ever consults anyone now. He never forgave the Duke about Lord Illiebud. Certainly, if a man wants to quarrel with all his friends, and to double the hatred of all his enemies, he had better become Prime Minister. Are you really sorry that such was his fate, Lady Glen? Ah, I sometimes ask myself that question, but I never get at an answer. I should have thought him a poltroon if he had declined. It is to be the greatest man in the greatest country in the world. Do ever so little and the men who write history must write about you. And no man has ever tried to be nobler than he till. Make no exception. If he be careworn and ill and weary, his manners cannot be the same as they were, but his purity is the same as ever. I don't know that it would remain so. I believe in him, Marie, more than in any man, but I believe in none thoroughly. There is a devil creeps in upon them when their hands are strengthened. I do not know what I would have wished. Whenever I do wish, I always wish wrong. Ah, me! When I think of all those people I had down at Gatherum, of the trouble I took, and of the glorious anticipations in which I revelled, I do feel ashamed of myself. Do you remember when I was determined that that wretch should be member for Silverbridge? You haven't seen her since, Duchess? No, but I mean to see her. I couldn't make her first husband member, and therefore the man who is member is to be her second husband. But I'm almost sick of schemes. Oh, dear, I wish I knew something that was really pleasant to do. I have never really enjoyed anything since I was in love, and I only liked that because it was wicked. The Duchess was wrong in saying that the Duke of St. Bungay had cut them. The old man still remembered the kiss and still remembered the pledge. But he had found it very difficult to maintain his old relations with his friend. It was his opinion that the coalition had done all that was wanted from it, and that now had come the time when they might retire gracefully. It is, no doubt, hard for a Prime Minister to find an excuse for going. But if the Duke of Omnium would have been content to acknowledge that he was not the man to alter the county suffrage, an excuse might have been found that would have been injurious to no one. Mr. Monk and Mr. Gresham might have joined, and the present Prime Minister might have resigned, explaining that he had done all that he had been appointed to accomplish. He had, however, yielded at once to Mr. Monk, and now it was to be feared that the House of Commons would not accept the bill from his hands. In such a state of things, especially after that disagreement about Lord Oldybud, it was difficult for the old Duke to tender his advice. He was at every cabinet council. He always came when his presence was required, he was invariably good-humored, but it seemed to him that his work was done. He could hardly volunteer to tell his chief and his colleague that he would certainly be beaten in the House of Commons. And that therefore there was little more now to be done than to arrange the circumstances of their retirement. Nevertheless, as the period for the second reading of the bill came on, he resolved that he would discuss the matter with his friend. He owed it to himself to do so, and he also owed it to the man whom he had certainly placed in his present position. On himself politics had imposed a burden very much lighter than that which they had inflicted on his more energetic and much less practical colleague. Through his long life he had either been in office, or in such a position that men were sure that he would soon return to it. He had taken it, when it had come, willingly, and had always left it without a regret. As a man cuts in and out at a whist table, and enjoys both the game and the rest from the game, so had the Duke of St. Bungay been well pleased in either position. He was patriotic, but his patriotism did not disturb his digestion. He had been ambitious, but moderately ambitious, and his ambition had been gratified. It never occurred to him to be unhappy because he or his party were beaten on a measure. When President of the Council, he could do his duty and enjoy London life. When in opposition, he could linger in Italy till May and devote his leisure to his trees and his bullocks. He was always esteemed, always self-satisfied, and always Duke of St. Bungay. But with our Duke it was very different. Patriotism with him was a fever, and the public service an exacting mistress. As long as this had been all he had still been happy. Not trusting much in himself, he had never aspired to great power. But now at last, ambition had laid hold of him, and the feeling, not perhaps uncommon with such men, that personal dishonor would be attached to political failure. What would his future life be if he had so carried himself in his great office as to have shown himself to be unfit to resume it? Hitherto any office had sufficed him in which he might be useful. But now he must either be Prime Minister, or a silent, obscure, and humbled man. Dear Duke, I will be with you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m., if you can give me half an hour. Yours affectionately, St. B. The Prime Minister received this note one afternoon, a day or two before that appointed for the second reading, and meeting his friend within an hour in the House of Lords. Confirmed the appointment. "Shall I not rather come to you?" he said. But the old Duke, who lived in St. James's Square, declared that Carlton Terrace would be in his way to Downing Street, and so the matter was settled. Exactly at 11 the two ministers met. "I don't like troubling you," said the old man, "when I know that you have so much to think of. On the contrary, I have but little to think of, and my thoughts must be very much engaged, indeed, when they shall be too full to admit of my seeing you. Of course we are all anxious about this bill." The Prime Minister smiled. Anxious? Yes, indeed. His anxiety was of such a nature that it kept him awake all night, and never for a moment left his mind free by day. And of course we must be prepared as to what shall be done either in the event of success or of failure. You might as well read that, said the other. It only reached me this morning, or I should have told you of it. The letter was a communication from the Solicitor General containing his resignation. He had now studied the county suffrage bill closely, and regretted to say that he could not give it a conscientious support. It was a matter of sincerest sorrow to him that relations so pleasant should be broken, but he must resign his place, unless, indeed, the clauses as to redistribution could be withdrawn. Of course he did not say this as expecting that any such concession would be made to his opinion, but merely as indicating the matter on which his objection was so strong as to overrule all other considerations. All this he explained at great length. The pleasantness of the relations must have been on one side, said the veteran. He ought to have gone long since. And Lord Drummond has already as good as said that unless we will abandon the same clauses, he must oppose the bill in the Lords. And resign, of course. He meant that, I presume. Lord Ramsden has not spoken to me. The clauses will not stick in his throat. Nor ought they. If the lawyers have their own way about law they should be contented. The question is, whether in these circumstances we should postpone the second reading, asked the Prime Minister. Certainly not, said the other Duke. As to the Solicitor General you will have no difficulty. Sir Timothy was only placed there as a concession to his party. Drummond will no doubt continue to hold his office till we see what is done in the lower house. If the second reading be lost there, why then his lordship can go with the rest of us. Rattler says we shall have a majority. He and Roby are quite agreed about it. Between them they must know, said the Prime Minister, unintentionally pleading for himself. They ought to know, if any men do, but the crisis is exceptional. I suppose you think that if the second reading is lost we should resign? Oh, certainly. Or, after that, if the bill be much mutilated in committee? I don't know that I shall personally break my own heart about the bill. The existing difference in the suffrages is rather in accordance with my prejudices. But the country desires the measure, and I suppose we cannot consent to any such material alteration as these men suggest. As he spoke he laid his hand on Sir Timothy's letter. Mr. Monk would not hear of it, said the Prime Minister. Of course not. And you and I in this measure must stick to Mr. Monk. My great, indeed my only strong desire in the matter, is to act in strict unison with you. You are always good and true, Duke. For my own part one shall not in the least regret to find in all this an opportunity of resigning. We have done our work, and if, as I believe, a majority of the House would again support either Gresham or Monk as the head of the entire Liberal party, I think that that arrangement would be for the welfare of the country. Why should it make any difference to you? Why should you not return to the Council? I should not do so, certainly not at once, probably never. But you, who are in the very prime of your life. The Prime Minister did not smile now. He knit his brows and a dark shadow came across his face. I don't think I could do that, he said. Caesar could hardly have led a legion under Pompey. It has been done, greatly to the service of the country, and without the slightest loss of honor or character in him who did it. We need hardly talk of that, Duke. You think then that we shall fail, I mean, in the House of Commons. I do not know that failure in our House should be regarded as fatal. In 3 cases we should fail. The loss of any material clause in committee would be as bad as the loss of the bill. Oh, yes. And then, in spite of Messrs. Rattler and Roby, who have been wrong before and may be wrong now, we may lose the second reading. And the third chance against us? You would not probably try to carry on the bill with a very small majority. Not with 3 or 4. Nor, I think, with 6 or 7. It would be useless. My own belief is that we shall never carry the bill into committee. I have always known you to be right, Duke. I think that general opinion has set in that direction, and general opinion is generally right. Having come to that conclusion, I thought it best to tell you, in order that we might have our house in order. The Duke of Omnium, who with all his haughtiness and all his reserve, was the simplest man in the world and the least apt to pretend to be that which he was not, sighed deeply when he heard this. For my own part, continued his elder, I feel no regret that it should be so. It is the first large measure that we have tried to carry. We did not come in to carry large measures, my friend. Look back and see how many large measures Pitt carried, but he took the country safely through its most dangerous crisis. What have we done? Carried on the Queen's government prosperously for 3 years. Is that nothing for a minister to do? I have never been a friend of great measures, knowing that when they come fast, one after another, more is broken in the rattle than is repaired by the reform. We have done what Parliament and the country expected us to do, and to my poor judgment we have done it well. I do not feel much self-satisfaction, Duke. Well, we must see it out, and if it is as you anticipate, I shall be ready. Of course I have prepared myself for it. And if, of late, my mind has been less turned to retirement than it used to be, it has only been because I have become wedded to this measure, and have wished that it should be carried under our auspices. Then the old Duke took his leave, and the Prime Minister was left alone to consider the announcement that had been made to him. He had said that he had prepared himself, but, in so saying, he had hardly known himself. Hitherto, though he had been troubled by many doubts, he had still hoped. The report made to him by Mr. Rattler, backed as it had been by Mr. Roby's assurances, had almost sufficed to give him confidence. But Mr. Rattler and Mr. Roby combined were as nothing to the Duke of St. Bungay. The Prime Minister knew now, he felt that he knew, that his days were numbered. The resignation of that lingering old bishop was not completed, and the person in whom he believed would not have the see. He had meditated the making of a peer or two, having hitherto been very cautious in that respect. But he would do nothing of the kind if called upon by the House of Commons to resign with an uncompleted measure. But his thoughts soon ran away from the present to the future. What was now to come of himself? How should he use his future life, he who as yet had not passed his 47th year? He regretted much having made that apparently pretentious speech about Caesar, though he knew his old friend well enough to be sure that it would never be used against him. Who was he that he should class himself among the big ones of the world? A man may indeed measure small things by great, but the measurer should be careful to declare his own littleness when he illustrates his position by that of the topping ones of the earth. But the thing said had been true. Let the Pompey be who he might, he, the little Caesar of the day, could never now command another legion. He had once told Phineas Finn that he regretted that he had abstained from the ordinary amusements of English gentlemen. But he had abstained also from their ordinary occupations, except so far as politics is one of them. He cared nothing for oxen or for furrows. In regard to his own land he hardly knew whether the farms were large or small. He had been a scholar, and after a certain fitful fashion he had maintained his scholarship, but the literature to which he had been really attached had been that of blue books and newspapers. What was he to do with himself when called upon to resign? And he understood, or thought that he understood, his position too well to expect that after a while, with the usual interval, he might return to power. He had been Prime Minister, not as the leading politician on either side, not as the king of a party, but, so he told himself, as a stopgap. There could be nothing for him now till the insipidity of life should gradually fade away into the grave. After a while he got up and went off to his wife's apartment, the room in which she used to prepare her triumphs and where now she contemplated her disappointments. "I have had the Duke with me," he said. "What, at last? I do not know that he could have done any good by coming sooner. And what does his Grace say? He thinks that our days are numbered." "Pshaw, is that all? I could have told him that ever so long ago. It was hardly necessary that he should disturb himself at last to come and tell us such well-ventilated news. There isn't a porter at one of the clubs who doesn't know it. Then there will be the less surprise, and to those who are concerned perhaps the less mortification. "Did he tell you who was to succeed you?" asked the Duchess. "Not precisely. He ought to have done that, as I am sure he knows." "Everybody knows except you, Plantagenet. If you know, you can tell me." "Of course, I can. It will be Mr. Monk." "With all my heart, Glencora. Mr. Monk is a very good man. I wonder whether he'll do anything for us. Think how destitute we shall be. What if I were to ask him for a place? Would he not give it us? Will it make you unhappy, Cora?" "What, you're going?" "Yes, the change altogether." She looked him in the face for a moment before she answered. With a peculiar smile in her eyes to which he was well used, a smile half ludicrous and half pathetic, having in it also a dash of sarcasm. "I can dare to tell the truth," she said, "which you can't. I can be honest and straightforward. Yes, it will make me unhappy." "And you? Do you think that I cannot be honest too, at any rate to you? It does fret me. I do not like to think that I shall be without work. Yes, Othello's occupation will be gone, for a while. For a while." Then she came up to him and put both her hands on his breast. "But yet, Othello, I shall not be all unhappy. Where will be your contentment? In you. It was making you ill. Rough people, whom the tenderness of your nature could not well endure, trod upon you, and worried you with their teeth and wounded you everywhere. I could have turned at them again with my teeth, and given them worry for worry, but you could not. Now you will be saved from them, and so I shall not be discontented." All this she said looking up into his face, still with that smile which was half pathetic and half ludicrous. "Then I will be contented too," he said as he kissed her. Chapter 73. Only the Duke of Omnium. The night of the debate arrived, but before the debate was commenced Sir Timothy Beeswax got up to make a personal explanation. He thought it right to state to the House how it came to pass that he found himself bound to leave the ministry at so important a crisis in its existence. Then an observation was made by an honourable member of the government, presumably in a whisper, but still loud enough to catch the sharp ears of Sir Timothy, who now sat just below the gangway. It was said afterwards that the gentleman who made the observation, an Irish gentleman named Fitzgibbon, conspicuous rather for his loyalty to his party than his steadiness, had purposely taken the place in which he then sat, that Sir Timothy might hear the whisper. The whisper suggested that falling houses were often left by certain animals. It was certainly a very loud whisper, but, if gentlemen are to be allowed to whisper at all, it is almost impossible to restrain the volume of the voice. To restrain Mr. Fitzgibbon had always been found difficult. Sir Timothy, who did not lack pluck, turned at once upon his assailant, and declared that words had been used with reference to himself which the honourable member did not dare to get upon his legs and repeat. Larry Fitzgibbon, as the gentleman was called, looked him full in the face, but did not move his hat from his head or stir a limb. It was a pleasant little episode in the evening's work, and afforded satisfaction to the House generally. Then Sir Timothy went on with his explanation. The details of this measure, as soon as they were made known to him, appeared to him, he said, to be fraught with the gravest and most pernicious consequences. He was sure that the members of Her Majesty's government, who were hurrying on this measure with what he thought was indecent haste, ministers are always either indecent in their haste or treacherous in their delay, had not considered what they were doing. Or, if they had considered, were blind as to its results. He then attempted to discuss the details of the measure, but was called to order. A personal explanation could not be allowed to give him an opportunity of anticipating the debate. He contrived, however, before he sat down, to say some very heavy things against his late chief, and especially to congratulate the Duke on the services of the honourable gentleman, the member for Mayo, meaning thereby Mr. Lawrence Fitzgibbon. It would perhaps have been well for everybody if the measure could have been withdrawn and the ministry could have resigned without the debate, as everybody was convinced what would be the end of it. Let the second reading go as it might, the bill could not be carried. There are measures which require the hopeful hardiness of a new ministry, and the thoroughgoing energy of a young parliament, and this was one of them. The House was as fully agreed that this change was necessary, as it ever is agreed on any subject, but still the thing could not be done. Even Mr. Monk, who was the most earnest of men, felt the general slackness of all around him. The commotion and excitement which would be caused by a change of ministry might restore its proper tone to the House, but in its present condition it was unfit for the work. Nevertheless Mr. Monk made his speech, and put all his arguments into lucid order. He knew it was for nothing, but nevertheless it must be done. For hour after hour he went on, for it was necessary to give every detail of his contemplated proposition. He went through it as sedulously as though he had expected to succeed, and sat down about 9 o'clock in the evening. Then Sir Orlando moved the adjournment of the House till the morrow, giving as his reason for doing so the expedience of considering the details he had heard. To this no opposition was made, and the House was adjourned. On the following day the clubs were all alive with rumours as to the coming debate. It was known that a strong party had been formed under the auspices of Sir Orlando, and that with him Sir Timothy and other politicians were in close council. It was of course necessary that they should impart to many the secrets of their conclave. So that it was known early in the afternoon that it was the intention of the opposition not to discuss the bill, but to move that it be read a second time that day 6 months. The ministry had hardly expected this, as the bill was undoubtedly popular both in the House and the country. And if the opposition should be beaten in such a course, that defeat would tend greatly to strengthen the hands of the government. But if the foe could succeed in carrying a positive veto on the second reading, it would under all the circumstances be tantamount to a vote of want of confidence. "I'm afraid they know almost more than we do as to the feeling of members," said Mr. Roby to Mr. Rattler. "There isn't a man in the House whose feeling in the matter I don't know," said Rattler, "but I'm not quite so sure of their principles. On our own side, in our old party, there are a score of men who detest the Duke, though they would fain be true to the government. They have voted with him through thick and thin, and he has not spoken a word to one of them since he became Prime Minister. What are you to do with such a man? How are you to act with him? Lupton wrote to him the other day about something, answered the other, I forget what, and he got a note back from Warburton as cold as ice, an absolute slap in the face. Fancy treating a man like Lupton in that way, one of the most popular men in the House, related to half the peerage, and a man who thinks so much of himself. I shouldn't wonder if he were to vote against us, I shouldn't indeed." "It has all been the old Duke's doing," said Rattler, "and no doubt it was intended for the best. But the thing has been a failure from the beginning to the end. I knew it would be so. I don't think there has been a single man who has understood what a ministerial coalition really means except you and I. From the very beginning all your men were averse to it in spirit. Look how they were treated," said Mr. Roby. "Was it likely that they should be very staunch when Mr. Monk became leader of the House? There was a cabinet council that day which lasted but a few minutes. And it may easily be presumed that the ministers decided that they would all resign at once if Sir Orlando should carry his amendment. It is not unlikely that they were agreed to do the same if he should nearly carry it, leaving probably the Prime Minister to judge what narrow majority would constitute nearness. On this occasion all the gentlemen assembled were jocund in their manner, and apparently well satisfied, as though they saw before them an end to all their troubles. The Spartan boy did not even make a grimace when the wolf bit him beneath his frock, and these were all Spartan boys. Even the Prime Minister, who had fortified himself for the occasion, and who never wept in any company but that of his wife and his old friend, was pleasant in his manner and almost affable. "We shan't make this step towards the millennium just at present," he said to Phineas Finn as they left the room together, referring to words which Phineas had spoken on a former occasion, and which then had not been very well taken. "But we shall have made a step towards the step," said Phineas, "and in getting to a millennium even that is something." "I suppose we are all too anxious," said the Duke, "to see some great effects come from our own little doings. Good day. We shall know all about it tolerably early. Monk seems to think that it will be an attack on the ministry and not on the bill, and that it will be best to get a vote with as little delay as possible. I'll bet an even £5 note, said Mr. Lupton at the Carlton, that the present ministry is out tomorrow, and another that no one names 5 members of the next cabinet. You can help to win your first bet, said Mr. Beecham, a very old member, who, like many other Conservatives, had supported the coalition. I shall not do that, said Lupton, though I think I ought. I won't vote against the man in his misfortunes, though, upon my soul, I don't love him very dearly. I shall vote neither way, but I hope that Sir Orlando may succeed. If he do, who is to come in? Said the other. I suppose you don't want to serve under Sir Orlando? Nor certainly under the Duke of Omnium. We shall not want a Prime Minister as long as there are as good fish in the sea as have been caught out of it. There had lately been formed a new Liberal club, established on a broader basis than the Progress, and perhaps with a greater amount of aristocratic support. This had come up since the Duke had been Prime Minister. Certain busy men had never been quite contented with the existing state of things, and had thought that the Liberal party, with such assistance as such a club could give it, would be strong enough to rule alone. That the great Liberal party should be impeded in its work and its triumph by such men as Sir Orlando Drought and Sir Timothy Beeswax was odious to the club. All the Pallisers had, from time immemorial, run straight as Liberals, and therefore the club had been unwilling to oppose the Duke personally, though he was the chief of the coalition. And certain members of the government, Phineas Finn, for instance, Barrington Erle, and Mr. Rattler were on the committee of the club. But the club, as a club, was not averse to a discontinuance of the present state of things. Mr. Gresham might again become Prime Minister, if he would condescend so far, or Mr. Monk. It might be possible that the great Liberal triumph contemplated by the club might not be achieved by the present House. But the present House must go shortly, and then, with that assistance from a well-organized club, which had lately been so terribly wanting, the lack of which had made the coalition necessary, no doubt the British constituencies would do their duty, and a Liberal Prime Minister, pure and simple, might reign, almost forever. With this great future before it, the club was very lukewarm in its support of the present bill. I shall go down and vote for them of course, said Mr. O'Mahony, just for the look of the thing. In saying this Mr. O'Mahony expressed the feeling of the club, and the feeling of the Liberal party generally. There was something due to the Duke, but not enough to make it incumbent on his friends to maintain him in his position as Prime Minister. It was a great day for Sir Orlando. At 4:30 the House was full, not from any desire to hear Sir Orlando's arguments against the bill, but because it was felt that a good deal of personal interest would be attached to the debate. If one were asked in these days what gift should a Prime Minister ask first from the fairies, one would name the power of attracting personal friends. Eloquence, if it be too easy, may become almost a curse. Patriotism is suspected, and sometimes sinks almost to pedantry. A Jove-born intellect is hardly wanted, and clashes with the inferiorities. Industry is exacting. Honesty is unpractical. Truth is easily offended. Dignity will not bend. But the man who can be all things to all men, who has ever a kind word to speak, a pleasant joke to crack, who can forgive all sins, who is ever prepared for friend or foe but never very bitter to the latter, who forgets not men's names, and is always ready with little words, he is the man who will be supported at a crisis such as this that was now in the course of passing. It is for him that men will struggle, and talk, and, if needs be, fight, as though the very existence of the country depended on his political security. The present man would receive no such defense. But still the violent deposition of a Prime Minister is always a memorable occasion. Sir Orlando made his speech, and, as had been anticipated, it had very little to do with the bill, and was almost exclusively an attack upon his late chief. He thought, he said, that this was an occasion on which they had better come to a direct issue with as little delay as possible. If he rightly read the feeling of the House, no bill of this magnitude coming from the present ministry would be likely to be passed in an efficient condition. The Duke had frittered away his support in that House, and as a minister had lost that confidence which a majority of the House had once been willing to place in him. We need not follow Sir Orlando through his speech. He alluded to his own services, and declared that he was obliged to withdraw them because the Duke would not trust him with the management of his own office. He had reason to believe that other gentlemen who had attached themselves to the Duke's ministry had found themselves equally crippled by this passion for autocratic rule. Hereupon a loud chorus of disapprobation came from the Treasury bench, which was fully answered by opposing noises from the other side of the House. Sir Orlando declared that he need only point to the fact that the ministry had been already shivered by the secession of various gentlemen. "Only two," said a voice. Sir Orlando was turning round to contradict the voice when he was greeted by another. "And those the weakest," said the other voice, which was indubitably that of Larry Fitzgibbon. "I will not speak of myself," said Sir Orlando pompously. "But I am authorized to tell the House that the noble lord who is now Secretary of State for the Colonies only holds his office till this crisis shall have passed." After that there was some sparring of a very bitter kind between Sir Timothy and Phineas Finn, till at last it seemed that the debate was to degenerate into a war of man against man. Phineas, and Earl, and Lawrence Fitzgibbon allowed themselves to be lashed into anger, and, as far as words went, had the best of it. But of what use could it be? Every man there had come into the House prepared to vote for or against the Duke of Omnium, or resolved, like Mr. Lupton, not to vote at all. And it was hardly on the cards that a single vote should be turned this way or that by any violence of speaking. "Let it pass," said Mr. Monk in a whisper to Phineas. "The fire is not worth the fuel." "I know the Duke's faults," said Phineas, "but these men know nothing of his virtues, and when I hear them abuse him I cannot stand it." Early in the night, before 12 o'clock, the House divided, and even at the moment of the division no one quite knew how it would go. There would be many who would of course vote against the amendment as being simply desirous of recording their opinion in favor of the bill generally. And there were some who thought that Sir Orlando and his followers had been too forward, and too confident of their own standing in the House, in trying so violent a mode of opposition. It would have been better, these men thought, to have ensured success by a gradual and persistent opposition to the bill itself. But they hardly knew how thoroughly men may be alienated by silence and a cold demeanor. Sir Orlando on the division was beaten, but was beaten only by 9. "He can't go on with his bill," said Rattler in one of the lobbies of the House. "I defy him. The House wouldn't stand it, you know." "No minister," said Roby, "could carry a measure like that with a majority of 9 on a vote of confidence." The House was of course adjourned, and Mr. Monk went at once to Carlton Terrace. "I wish it had only been 3 or 4, said the Duke, laughing. "Why so?" "Because there would have been less doubt." "Is there any at present?" "Less possibility for doubt, I will say." "You would not wish to make the attempt with such a majority?" "I could not do it, Duke." "I quite agree with you. But there will be those who will say that the attempt might be made, who will accuse us of being faint-hearted because we do not make it. They will be men who understand nothing of the temper of the House." "Very likely. But still, I wish the majority had only been 2 or 3. There is little more to be said, I suppose." "Very little, Your Grace. We had better meet tomorrow at 2, and, if possible, I will see Her Majesty in the afternoon. Good night, Mr. Monk." "Good night, Duke. My reign is ended. You are a good deal an older man than I, and yet probably yours has yet to begin." Mr. Monk smiled and shook his head as he left the room, not trusting himself to discuss so large a subject at so late an hour of the night. Without waiting a moment after his colleague's departure, the Prime Minister, for he was still Prime Minister, went into his wife's room. Knowing that she was waiting up till she should hear the result of the division, and there he found Mrs. Finn with her. "Is it over?" asked the Duchess. "Yes, there has been a division. Mr. Monk has just been with me. Well, we have beaten them, of course, as we always do, said the Duke, attempting to be pleasant. You didn't suppose there was anything to fear? Your husband has always bid you keep up your courage. Has he not, Mrs. Finn? My husband has lost his senses, I think, she said. He has taken to such storming and raving about his political enemies that I hardly dare to open my mouth. Tell me what has been done, Plantagenet, ejaculated the Duchess. Don't you be as unreasonable as Mrs. Finn, Cora. The House has voted against Sir Orlando's amendment by a majority of 9. Only 9. And I shall cease to be Prime Minister tomorrow. You don't mean to say that it's settled? Quite settled. The play has been played, and the curtain has fallen, and the lights are being put out, and the poor weary actors may go home to bed. But on such an amendment surely any majority would have done. No, my dear. I will not name a number, but 9 certainly would not do. And it is all over? My ministry is all over, if you mean that. Then everything is over for me. I shall settle down in the country and build cottages, and mix draughts. You, Marie, will still be going up the tree. If Mr. Finn manages well, he may come to be Prime Minister some day. He has hardly such ambition, Lady Glen. The ambition will come fast enough, will it not, Plantagenet? Let him once begin to dream of it as possible, and the desire will soon be strong enough. How should you feel if it were so? It is quite impossible, said Mrs. Finn, gravely. I don't see why anything is impossible. Sir Orlando will be Prime Minister now, and Sir Timothy Beeswax Lord Chancellor. After that anybody may hope to be anything. Well, I suppose we may go to bed. Is your carriage here, my dear? I hope so. Ring the bell, Plantagenet, for somebody to see her down. Come to lunch tomorrow because I shall have so many groans to utter. What beasts, what brutes, what ungrateful wretches men are, worse than women when they get together in numbers enough to be bold. Why have they deserted you? What have we not done for them? Think of all the new bedroom furniture that we sent to Gatherum merely to keep the party together. There were thousands of yards of linen, and it has all been of no use. Don't you feel like Wolsey, Plantagenet? Not in the least, my dear. No one will take anything away from me that is my own. For me, I am almost as much divorced as Catherine, and have had my head cut off as completely as Anne Boleyn and the rest of them. Go away, Marie, because I am going to have a cry by myself. The Duke himself on that night put Mrs. Finn into her carriage. And as he walked with her downstairs he asked her whether she believed the Duchess to be in earnest in her sorrow. She so mixes up her mirth and woe together, said the Duke, that I myself sometimes can hardly understand her. I think she does regret it, Duke. She told me but the other day that she would be contented. A few weeks will make her so. As for your Grace, I hope I may congratulate you. Oh yes, I think so. We none of us like to be beaten when we have taken a thing in hand. There is always a little disappointment at first. But, upon the whole, it is better as it is. I hope it will not make your husband unhappy. Not for his own sake. He will go again into the middle of the scramble and fight on one side or the other. For my own part one think opposition the pleasantest. Good night, Duke. I am so sorry that I should have troubled you. Then he went alone to his own room, and sat there without moving for a couple of hours. Surely it was a great thing to have been Prime Minister of England for 3 years, a prize of which nothing now could rob him. He ought not to be unhappy. And yet he knew himself to be wretched and disappointed. It had never occurred to him to be proud of being a duke, or to think of his wealth otherwise than a chance incident of his life, advantageous indeed, but by no means a source of honor. And he had been aware that he had owed his first seat in Parliament to his birth, and probably also his first introduction to official life. An heir to a dukedom, if he will only work hard, may almost with certainty find himself received into one or the other regiment in Downing Street. It had not in his early days been with him as it had with his friends Mr. Monk and Phineas Finn, who had worked their way from the very ranks. But even a duke cannot become prime minister by favor. Surely he had done something of which he might be proud. And so he tried to console himself. But to have done something was nothing to him, nothing to his personal happiness, unless there was also something left for him to do. How should it be with him now, how for the future? Would men ever listen to him again, or allow him again to work in their behoof, as he used to do in his happy days in the House of Commons? He feared that it was all over for him, and that for the rest of his days he must simply be the Duke of Omnium. Chapter 74. I am disgraced and shamed. Soon after the commencement of the session Arthur Fletcher became a constant visitor in Manchester Square, dining with the old barrister almost constantly on Sundays. And not unfrequently on other days when the house and his general engagements would permit it. Between him and Emily's father there was no secret and no misunderstanding. Mr. Wharton quite understood that the young Member of Parliament was earnestly purposed to marry his daughter, and Fletcher was sure of all the assistance and support which Mr. Wharton could give him. The name of Lopez was very rarely used between them. It had been tacitly agreed that there was no need that it should be mentioned. The man had come like a destroying angel between them and their fondest hopes. Neither could ever be what he would have been had that man never appeared to destroy their happiness. But the man had gone away, not without a tragedy that was appalling. And each thought that, as regarded him, he and the tragedy might be, if not forgotten at least put aside. If only that other person in whom they were interested could be taught to seem to forget him. It is not love, said the father, but a feeling of shame. Arthur Fletcher shook his head, not quite agreeing with this. It was not that he feared that she loved the memory of her late husband. Such love was, he thought, impossible. But there was, he believed, something more than the feeling which her father described as shame. There was pride also. A determination in her own bosom not to confess the fault she had made in giving herself to him whom she must now think to have been so much the least worthy of her two suitors. Her fortune will not be what I once promised you, said the old man plaintively. I do not remember that I ever asked you as to her fortune, Arthur replied. Certainly not. If you had I should not have told you. But as I named a sum, it is right that I should explain to you that that man succeeded in lessening it by £6,000 or £7,000. If that were all. And I have promised Sir Alyard that Everett, as his heir, should have the use of a considerable portion of his share without waiting for my death. It is odd that the one of my children from whom I certainly expected the greater trouble should have fallen so entirely on his feet, and that the other, well, let us hope for the best. Everett seems to have taken up with Wharton as though it belonged to him already. And Emily. Well, my dear boy, let us hope that it may come right yet. You are not drinking your wine. Yes, pass the bottle, I'll have another glass before I go upstairs. In this way the time went by till Emily returned to town. The ministry had just then resigned, but I think that this great reactionary success, as it was called by the writer in the People's Banner, affected one member of the lower house much less than the return to London of Mrs. Lopez. Arthur Fletcher had determined that he would renew his suit as soon as a year should have expired since the tragedy which had made his love a widow, and that year had now passed away. He had known the day well, as had she, when she passed the morning weeping in her own room at Wharton. Now he questioned himself whether a year would suffice, whether both in mercy to her and with the view of realizing his own hopes he should give her some longer time for recovery. But he had told himself that it should be done at the end of a year, and as he had allowed no one to talk him out of his word, so neither would he be untrue to it himself. But it became with him a deep matter of business, a question of great difficulty, how he should arrange the necessary interview, whether he should plead his case with her at their first meeting, or whether he had better allow her to become accustomed to his presence in the house. His mother had attempted to ridicule him, because he was, as she said, afraid of a woman. He well remembered that he had never been afraid of Emily Wharton when they had been quite young, little more than a boy and girl together. Then he had told her of his love over and over again, and had found almost a comfortable luxury in urging her to say a word, which she had never indeed said, but which probably in those days he still hoped that she would say. And occasionally he had feigned to be angry with her, and had tempted her on to little quarrels with a boyish idea that quick reconciliation would perhaps throw her into his arms. But now it seemed to him that an age had passed since those days. His love had certainly not faded. There had never been a moment when that had been on the wing. But now the azure plumage of his love had become grey as the wings of a dove, and the gorgeousness of his dreams had sobered into hopes and fears which were a constant burden to his heart. There was time enough, still time enough for happiness if she would yield, and time enough for the dull pressure of unsatisfied aspirations should she persist in her refusal. At last he saw her, almost by accident, and that meeting certainly was not fit for the purpose of his suit. He called at Stone Buildings the day after her arrival, and found her at her father's chambers. She had come there keeping some appointment with him, and certainly had not expected to meet her lover. He was confused and hardly able to say a word to account for his presence, but she greeted him with almost sisterly affection, saying some word of Longbarns and his family, telling him how Everett, to Sir Alyard's great delight, had been sworn in as a magistrate for the county, and how at the last hunt meeting John Fletcher had been asked to take the county hounds, because old Lord Weobley at 75 had declared himself to be unable any longer to ride as a master of hounds ought to ride. All these things Arthur had of course heard, such news being too important to be kept long from him, but on none of these subjects had he much to say. He stuttered and stammered, and quickly went away. Not, however, before he had promised to come and dine as usual on the next Sunday. And not without observing that the anniversary of that fatal day of release had done something to lighten the sombre load of mourning which the widow had hitherto worn. Yes, he would dine there on the Sunday, but how would it be with him then? Mr. Wharton never went out of the house on a Sunday evening, and could hardly be expected to leave his own drawing-room for the sake of giving a lover an opportunity. No. He must wait till that evening should have passed, and then make the occasion for himself as best he might. The Sunday came and the dinner was eaten, and after dinner there was the single bottle of port and the single bottle of claret. "How do you think she is looking?" asked the father. "She was as pale as death before we got her down into the country." "Upon my word, sir," said he, "I've hardly looked at her. It is not a matter of looks now, as it used to be. It has got beyond that. It is not that I am indifferent to seeing a pretty face, or that I have no longer an opinion of my own about a woman's figure. But there grows up, I think, a longing which almost kills that consideration. To me she is as beautiful as ever," said the father proudly. Fletcher did manage, when in the drawing-room, to talk for a while about John and the hounds, and then went away, having resolved that he would come again on the very next day. Surely she would not give an order that he should be denied admittance. She had been too calm, too even, too confident in herself for that. Yes. He would come and tell her plainly what he had to say. He would tell it with all the solemnity of which he was capable, with a few words, and those the strongest which he could use. Should she refuse him, as he almost knew that she would at first, then he would tell her of her father and of the wishes of all their joint friends. "Nothing," he would say to her, "nothing but personal dislike can justify you in refusing to heal so many wounds." As he fixed on these words he failed to remember how little probable it is that a lover should ever be able to use the phrases he arranges. On Monday he came, and asked for Mrs. Lopez, slurring over the word as best he could. The butler said his mistress was at home. Since the death of the man he had so thoroughly despised, the old servant had never called her Mrs. Lopez. Arthur was shown upstairs, and found the lady he sought, but he found Mrs. Roby also. It may be remembered that Mrs. Roby, after the tragedy, had been refused admittance into Mr. Wharton's house. Since that there had been some correspondence, and a feeling had prevailed that the woman was not to be quarrelled with forever. "I did not do it, Papa, because of her," Emily had said with some scorn, and that scorn had procured Mrs. Roby's pardon. She was now making a morning call, and suiting her conversation to the black dress of her niece. Arthur was horrified at seeing her. Mrs. Roby had always been to him odious, not only as a personal enemy but as a vulgar woman. He, at any rate, attributed to her a great part of the evil that had been done, feeling sure that had there been no house round the corner, Emily Wharton would never have become Mrs. Lopez. As it was, he was forced to shake hands with her, and forced to listen to the funereal tone in which Mrs. Roby asked him if he did not think that Mrs. Lopez looked much improved by her sojourn in Herefordshire. He shrank at the sound, and then, in order that it might not be repeated, took occasion to show that he was allowed to call his early playmate by her Christian name. Mrs. Roby, thinking that she ought to check him, remarked that Mrs. Lopez's return was a great thing for Mr. Wharton. Thereupon Arthur Fletcher seized his hat off the ground, wished them both good-bye, and hurried out of the room. "What a very odd manner he has taken up since he became a member of Parliament," said Mrs. Roby. Emily was silent for a moment, and then with an effort, with intense pain, she said a word or two which she thought had better be at once spoken. "He went because he does not like to hear that name." "Good gracious! And Papa does not like it." "Don't say a word about it, Aunt, pray don't, but call me Emily." "Are you going to be ashamed of your name?" "Never mind, Aunt. If you think it wrong you must stay away, but I will not have Papa wounded." "Oh, if Mr. Wharton wishes it, of course." That evening Mrs. Roby told Dick Roby, her husband, what an old fool Mr. Wharton was. The next day, quite early, Fletcher was again at the house and was again admitted upstairs. The butler, no doubt, knew well enough why he came, and also knew that the purport of his coming had at any rate the sanction of Mr. Wharton. The room was empty when he was shown into it, but she came to him very soon. "I went away yesterday rather abruptly," he said. "I hope you did not think me rude." "Oh no. Your aunt was here, and I had something I wished to say but could not say very well before her. I knew that she had driven you away. You and Aunt Harriet were never great friends." "Never. But I will forgive her everything. I will forgive all the injuries that have been done me if you now will do as I ask you." Of course she knew what it was that he was about to ask. When he had left her at Longbarns without saying a word of his love, without giving her any hint whereby she might allow herself to think that he intended to renew his suit. Then she had wept because it was so. Though her resolution had been quite firm as to the duty which was incumbent on her of remaining in her desolate condition of almost nameless widowhood. Yet she had been unable to refrain from bitter tears because he also had seemed to see that such was her duty. But now again, knowing that the request was coming, feeling once more confident of the constancy of his love, she was urgent with herself as to that heavy duty. She would be unwomanly, dead to all shame, almost inhuman, were she to allow herself again to indulge in love after all the havoc she had made. She had been little more than a bride when that husband, for whom she had so often been forced to blush, had been driven by the weight of his misfortunes and disgraces to destroy himself. By the marriage she had made she had overwhelmed her whole family with dishonor. She had done it with a persistency of perverse self-will which she herself could not now look back upon without wonder and horror. She, too, should have died as well as he, only that death had not been within the compass of her powers as of his. How then could she forget it all, and wipe it away from her mind, as she would figures from a slate with a wet towel? How could it be fit that she should again be a bride with such a spectre of a husband haunting her memory? She had known that the request was to be made when he had come so quickly, and had not doubted it for a moment when he took his sudden departure. She had known it well, when just now the servant told her that Mr. Fletcher was in the drawing-room below. But she was quite certain of the answer she must make. "I should be sorry you should ask me anything I cannot do," she said in a very low voice. "I will ask you for nothing for which I have not your father's sanction. The time has gone by, Arthur, in which I might well have been guided by my father. There comes a time when personal feelings must be stronger than a father's authority. Papa cannot see me with my own eyes, he cannot understand what I feel. It is simply this, that he would have me to be other than I am. But I am what I have made myself. You have not heard me as yet. You will hear me? Oh, yes. I have loved you ever since I was a boy. He paused as though he expected that she would make some answer to this. But of course there was nothing that she could say. I have been true to you since we were together almost as children. It is your nature to be true. In this matter, at any rate, I shall never change. I never for a moment had a doubt about my love. There never has been anyone else whom I have ventured to compare with you. Then came that great trouble. Emily, you must let me speak freely this once, as so much, to me at least, depends on it. Say what you will, Arthur. Do not wound me more than you can help. God knows how willingly I would heal every wound without a word if it could be done. I don't know whether you ever thought what I suffered when he came among us and robbed me, well, I will not say robbed me of your love. Because it was not mine, but took away with him that which I had been trying to win. I did not think a man would feel it like that. Why shouldn't a man feel as well as a woman? I had set my heart on having you for my wife. Can any desire be dearer to a man than that? Then he came. Well, dearest, surely I may say that he was not worthy of you. We were neither of us worthy, she said. I need not tell you that we all grieved. It seemed to us down in Herefordshire as though a black cloud had come upon us. We could not speak of you, nor yet could we be altogether silent. Of course you condemned me, as an outcast. Did I write to you as though you were an outcast? Did I treat you when I saw you as an outcast? When I come to you today, is that proof that I think you to be an outcast? I have never deceived you, Emily. Never. Then you will believe me when I say that through it all not one word of reproach or contumely has ever passed my lips in regard to you. That you should have given yourself to one whom I could not think to be worthy of you was, of course, a great sorrow. Had he been a prince of men it would, of course, have been a sorrow to me. How it went with you during your married life I will not ask. I was unhappy. I would tell you everything if I could. I was very unhappy. Then came the end. She was now weeping, with her face buried in her handkerchief. I would spare you if I knew how, but there are some things which must be said. No, no. I will bear it all, from you. Well. His success had not lessened my love. Though then I could have no hope, though you were utterly removed from me, all that could not change me. There it was, as though my arm or my leg had been taken from me. It was bad to live without an arm or leg, but there was no help. I went on with my life and tried not to look like a whipped cur. Though John from time to time would tell me that I failed. But now that it has again all changed, what would you have me do now? It may be that after all my limb may be restored to me, that I may be again as other men are, whole, and sound, and happy, so happy. When it may possibly be within my reach, am I not to look for my happiness? He paused, but she wept on without speaking a word. There are those who will say that I should wait till all these signs of woe have been laid aside. But why should I wait? There has come a great blot upon your life, and is it not well that it should be covered as quickly as possible? It can never be covered. You mean that it can never be forgotten. No doubt there are passages in our life which we cannot forget, though we bury them in the deepest silence. All this can never be driven out of your memory, nor from mine. But it need not therefore blacken all our lives. In such a condition we should not be ruled by what the world thinks. Not at all. I care nothing for what the world thinks. I am below all that. It is what I think, I myself, of myself. Will you think of no one else? Are any of your thoughts for me, or for your father? Oh, yes, for my father. I need hardly tell you what he wishes. You must know how you can best give him back the comfort he has lost. But, Arthur, even for him I cannot do everything. There is one question to be asked, he said, rising from her feet and standing before her, but one. And what you do should depend entirely on the answer which you may be able truly to make to that. This he said so solemnly that he startled her. What question, Arthur? Do you love me? To this question at the moment she could make no reply. Of course I know that you did not love me when you married him. Love is not all of one kind. You know what love I mean. You did not love me then. You could not have loved me, though, perhaps, I thought I had deserved your love. But love will change, and memory will sometimes bring back old fancies when the world has been stern and hard. When we were very young I think you loved me. Do you remember 7 years ago at Longbarns, when they parted us and sent me away, because we were so young? They did not tell us then, but I think you knew. I know that I knew, and went nigh to swear that I would drown myself. You loved me then, Emily. I was a child then. Now you are not a child. Do you love me now, today? If so, give me your hand, and let the past be buried in silence. All this has come and gone, and has nearly made us old. But there is life before us yet, and if you are to me as I am to you it is better that our lives should be lived together. Then he stood before her with his hand stretched out. I cannot do it, she said. And why? I cannot be other than the wretched thing I have made myself. But do you love me? I cannot analyze my heart. Love you, yes. I have always loved you. Everything about you is dear to me. I can triumph in your triumphs, rejoice at your joy, weep at your sorrows, be ever anxious that all good things may come to you. But, Arthur, I cannot be your wife. Not though it would make us happy, Fletchers and Whartons all alike. Do you think I have not thought it over? Do you think that I have forgotten your first letter? Knowing your heart, as I do know it, do you imagine that I have spent a day, an hour, for months past, without asking myself what answer I should make to you if the sweet constancy of your nature should bring you again to me? I have trembled when I have heard your voice. My heart has beat at the sound of your footstep as though it would burst. Do you think I have never told myself what I had thrown away? But it is gone, and it is not now within my reach. It is, he said, throwing himself on his knees, and twining his arms round her. No, 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 never. I am disgraced and shamed. I have lain among the pots till I am foul and blackened. Take your arms away. They shall not be defiled, she said as she sprang to her feet. You shall not have the thing that he has left. Emily, it is the only thing in the world that I crave. Be a man and conquer your love, as I will. Get it under your feet and press it to death. Tell yourself that it is shameful and must be abandoned. That you, Arthur Fletcher, should marry the widow of that man, the woman that he had thrust so far into the mire that she can never again be clean, you, the chosen one, the bright star among us all. You, whose wife should be the fairest, the purest, the tenderest of us all, a flower that has yet been hardly breathed on. While I, Arthur, she said, I know my duty better than that. I will not seek an escape from my punishment in that way, nor will I allow you to destroy yourself. You have my word as a woman that it shall not be so. Now I do not mind your knowing whether I love you or no. He stood silent before her, not able for the moment to go on with his prayer. And now, go, she said. God bless you, and give you some day a fair and happy wife. And, Arthur, do not come again to me. If you will let it be so, I shall have a delight in seeing you. But not if you come as you have come now. And, Arthur, spare me with Papa. Do not let him think that it is all my fault that I cannot do the thing which he wishes. Then she left the room before he could say another word to her. But it was all her fault. No, in that direction he could not spare her. It must be told to her father, though he doubted his own power of describing all that had been said. "Do not come again to me," she had said. At the moment he had been left speechless. But if there was one thing fixed in his mind, it was the determination to come again. He was sure now, not only of love that might have sufficed, but of hot, passionate love. She had told him that her heart had beat at his footsteps, and that she had trembled as she listened to his voice, and yet she expected that he would not come again. But there was a violence of decision about the woman which made him dread that he might still come in vain. She was so warped from herself by the conviction of her great mistake, so prone to take shame to herself for her own error, so keenly alive to the degradation to which she had been submitted, that it might yet be impossible to teach her that, though her husband had been vile and she mistaken, yet she had not been soiled by his baseness. He went at once to the old barrister's chambers and told him the result of the meeting. "She is still a fool," said the father, not understanding at second hand the depths of his daughter's feeling. "No, sir, not that. She feels herself degraded by his degradation. If it be possible we must save her from that. She did degrade herself. Not as she means it. She is not degraded in my eyes. Why should she not take the only means in her power of rescuing herself and rescuing us all from the evil that she did? She owes it to you, to me, and to her brother. I would hardly wish her to come to me in payment of such a debt." "There is no room left," said Mr. Wharton angrily, "for soft sentimentality. Well, she must take her bed as she makes it. It is very hard on me, I know. Considering what she used to be, it is marvelous to me that she should have so little idea left of doing her duty to others." Arthur Fletcher found that the barrister was at the moment too angry to hear reason, or to be made to understand anything of the feelings of mixed love and admiration with which he himself was animated at the moment. He was obliged therefore to content himself with assuring the father that he did not intend to give up the pursuit of his daughter. Chapter 75. The Great Wharton Alliance. When Mr. Wharton got home on that day he said not a word to Emily as to Arthur Fletcher. He had resolved to take various courses, first to tell her roundly that she was neglecting her duty to herself and to her family, and that he would no longer take her part and be her good friend unless she would consent to marry the man whom she had confessed that she loved. But as he thought of this he became aware, first that he could not carry out such a threat, and then that he would lack even the firmness to make it. There was something in her face, something even in her dress, something in her whole manner to himself, which softened him and reduced him to vassalage directly he saw her. Then he determined to throw himself on her compassion and to implore her to put an end to all this misery by making herself happy. But as he drew near home he found himself unable to do even this. How is a father to beseech his widowed daughter to give herself away in a second marriage? And therefore when he entered the house and found her waiting for him, he said nothing. At first she looked at him wistfully, anxious to learn by his face whether her lover had been with him. But when he spoke not a word, simply kissing her in his usual quiet way, she became cheerful in manner and communicative. "Papa," she said, "I have had a letter from Mary." "Well, my dear?" "Just a nice chatty letter, full of Everett, of course. Everett is a great man now. I am sure that you are very glad that he is what he is. Will you see Mary's letter?" Mr. Wharton was not specially given to reading young ladies' correspondence, and did not know why this particular letter should be offered to him. "You don't suspect anything at Wharton, do you?" she asked. "Suspect anything? No, I don't suspect anything." But now, having had his curiosity aroused, he took the letter which was offered to him and read it. The letter was as follows. Wharton, Thursday. Dearest Emily, we all hope that you had a pleasant journey up to London, and that Mr. Wharton is quite well. Your brother Everett came over to Longbarns the day after you started and drove me back to Wharton in the dog-cart. It was such a pleasant journey, though, now I remember, it rained all the way. But Everett has always so much to say that I didn't mind the rain. I think it will end in John taking the hounds. He says he won't, because he does not wish to be the slave of the whole county. But he says it in that sort of way that we all think he means to do it. Everett tells him that he ought, because he is the only hunting man on this side of the county who can afford to do it without feeling it much. And of course, what Everett says will go a long way with him. Sarah was John Fletcher's wife. Is rather against it. But if he makes up his mind, she'll be sure to turn round. Of course it makes us all very anxious at present to know how it is to end, for the master of the hounds always is the leading man in our part of the world. Papa went to the bench at Ross yesterday and took Everett with him. It was the first time that Everett had sat there. He says I am to tell his father he has not hung anybody as yet. They have already begun to cut down, or what they call stub up, barn-ton spinneys. Everett said that it is no good keeping it as a wood, and Papa agreed. So it is to go into the home farm, and Griffiths is to pay rent for it. I don't like having it cut down as the boys always used to get nuts there, but Everett says it won't do to keep woods for little boys to get nuts. Mary Stocking has been very ill since you went, and I'm afraid she won't last long. When they get to be so very bad with rheumatism, I almost think it's wrong to pray for them, because they are in so much pain. We thought at one time that Mama's ointment had done her good, but when we came to inquire, we found she had swallowed it. Wasn't it dreadful? But it didn't seem to do her any harm. Everett says that it wouldn't make any difference which she did. Papa is beginning to be afraid that Everett is a radical. But I'm sure he's not. He says he is as good a conservative as there is in all Herefordshire, only that he likes to know what is to be conserved. Papa said after dinner yesterday that everything English ought to be maintained. Everett said that according to that we should have kept the Star Chamber. Of course I would, said Papa. Then they went at it, hammer and tongs. Everett had the best of it. At any rate he talked the longest. But I do hope he is not a radical. No country gentleman ought to be a radical. Ought he, dear? Mrs. Fletcher says you are to get the lozenges at Squire's in Oxford Street, and be sure to ask for the Vade Mecum lozenges. She is all in a flutter about the hounds. She says she hopes John will do nothing of the kind because of the expense, but we all know that she would like him to have them. The subscription is not very good, only £1,500, and it would cost him ever so much a year. But everybody says that he is very rich and that he ought to do it. If you see Arthur, give him our love. Of course a member of Parliament is too busy to write letters. But I don't think Arthur ever was good at writing. Everett says that men never ought to write letters. Give my love to Mr. Wharton. I am, dearest Emily, your most affectionate cousin, Mary Wharton. Everett is a fool, said Mr. Wharton as soon as he had read the letter. Why is he a fool, Papa? Because he will quarrel with Sir Alured about politics before he knows where he is. What business has a young fellow like that to have an opinion either one side or the other, before his betters? But Everett always had strong opinions. It didn't matter as long as he only talked nonsense at a club in London, but now he'll break that old man's heart. But, Papa, don't you see anything else? I see that John Fletcher is going to make an ass of himself and spend £1,000 a year in keeping up a pack of hounds for other people to ride after. I think I see something else besides that. What do you see? Would it annoy you if Everett were to become engaged to Mary? Then Mr. Wharton whistled. To be sure she does put his name into every line of her letter. No, it wouldn't annoy me. I don't see why he shouldn't marry his second cousin if he likes. Only if he is engaged to her, I think it odd that he shouldn't write and tell us. I'm sure he's not engaged to her yet. She wouldn't write at all in that way if they were engaged. Everybody would be told at once, and Sir Alured would never be able to keep it a secret. Why should there be a secret? But I'm sure she is very fond of him. Mary would never write about any man in that way unless she were beginning to be attached to him. About 10 days after this there came 2 letters from Wharton Hall to Manchester Square, the shortest of which shall be given first. It ran as follows. My dear father. I have proposed to my cousin Mary, and she has accepted me. Everybody here seems to like the idea. I hope it will not displease you. Of course you and Emily will come down. I will tell you when the day is fixed. Your affectionate son, Everett Wharton. This the old man read as he sat at breakfast with his daughter opposite to him, while Emily was reading a very much longer letter from the same house. So it's going to be just as you guessed, he said. I was quite sure of it, Papa. Is that from Everett? Is he very happy? Upon my word, I can't say whether he's happy or not. If he had got a new horse he would have written at much greater length about it. It seems, however, to be quite fixed. Oh, yes. This is from Mary. She is happy at any rate. I suppose men never say so much about these things as women. May I see Mary's letter? I don't think it would be quite fair, Papa. It's only a girl's rhapsody about the man she loves, very nice and womanly, but not intended for anyone but me. It does not seem that they mean to wait very long. Why should they wait? Is any day fixed? Mary says that Everett talks about the middle of May. Of course you will go down. We must both go. You will at any rate. Don't promise for me just at present. It must make Sir Alyard very happy. It is almost the same as finding himself at last with a son of his own. I suppose they will live at Wharton altogether now, unless Everett gets into Parliament. But the reader may see the young lady's letter, though her future father-in-law was not permitted to do so. And will perceive that there was a paragraph at the close of it which perhaps was more conducive to Emily's secrecy than her feelings as to the sacred obligations of female correspondence. Monday, Wharton. Dearest Emily. I wonder whether you will be much surprised at the news I have to tell you. You cannot be more so than I am at having to write it. It has all been so very sudden that I almost feel ashamed of myself. Everett has proposed to me, and I have accepted him. There, now you know it all. Though you never can know how very dearly I love him and how thoroughly I admire him. I do think that he is everything that a man ought to be, and that I am the most fortunate young woman in the world. Only isn't it odd that I should always have to live all my life in the same house, and never change my name, just like a man, or an old maid? But I don't mind that because I do love him so dearly and because he is so good. I hope he will write to you and tell you that he likes me. He has written to Mr. Wharton, I know. I was sitting by him and his letter didn't take him a minute. But he says that long letters about such things only give trouble. I hope you won't think my letter troublesome. He is not sitting by me now but has gone over to Longbarns to help to settle about the hounds. John is going to have them after all. I wish it hadn't happened just at this time because all the gentlemen do think so much about it. Of course Everett is one of the committee. Papa and Mama are both very, very glad of it. Of course it is nice for them as it will keep Everett and me here. If I had married anybody else, though I am sure I never should, she would have been very lonely. And of course Papa likes to think that Everett is already one of us. I hope they never will quarrel about politics. But, as Everett says, the world does change as it goes on, and young men and old men never will think quite the same about things. Everett told Papa the other day that if he could be put back a century he would be a radical. Then there were ever so many words. But Everett always laughs, and at last Papa comes round. I can't tell you, my dear, what a fuss we are in already about it all. Everett wants to have our marriage early in May, so that we may have 2 months in Switzerland before London is what he calls turned loose. And Papa says that there is no use in delaying, because he gets older every day. Of course that is true of everybody. So that we are all in a flutter about getting things. Mama did talk of going up to town, but I believe they have things now quite as good at Hereford. Sarah, when she was married, had all her things from London, but they say that there has been a great change since that. I am sure that I think that you may get anything you want at Muddocks and Crambles. But Mamma says I am to have my veil from Howell and James's. Of course you and Mr. Wharton will come. I shan't think it any marriage without. Papa and Mamma talk of it as quite of course. You know how fond Papa is of the bishop. I think he will marry us. I own I should like to be married by a bishop. It would make it so sweet and so solemn. Mr. Higginbottom could of course assist. But he is such an odd old man, with his snuff and his spectacles always tumbling off, that I shouldn't like to have no one else. I have often thought that if it were only for marrying people we ought to have a nicer rector at Wharton. Almost all the tenants have been to wish me joy. They are very fond of Everett already, and now they feel that there will never be any very great change. I do think it is the very best thing that could be done, even if it were not that I am so thoroughly in love with him. I didn't think I should ever be able to own that I was in love with a man. But now I feel quite proud of it. I don't mind telling you because he is your brother, and I think that you will be glad of it. He talks very often about you. Of course you know what it is that we all wish. I love Arthur Fletcher almost as much as if he were my brother. He is my sister's brother-in-law, and if he could become my husband's brother-in-law too, I should be so happy. Of course we all know that he wishes it. Write immediately to wish me joy. Perhaps you could go to Howell and James's about the veil. And promise to come to us in May. Sarah says the veil ought to cost about £30. Dearest, dearest Emily. I shall so soon be your most affectionate sister, Mary Wharton. Emily's answer was full of warm, affectionate congratulations. She had much to say in favor of Everett. She promised to use all her little skill at Howell and James's. She expressed a hope that the overtures to be made in regard to the bishop might be successful. And she made kind remarks even as to Muddocks and Cramble. But she would not promise that she herself would be at Wharton on the happy day. Dear Mary, she said, remember what I have suffered, and that I cannot be quite as other people are. I could not stand at your marriage in black clothes, nor should I have the courage even if I had the will to dress myself in others. None of the Whartons had come to her wedding. There was no feeling of anger now left as to that. She was quite aware that they had done right to stay away. But the very fact that it had been right that they should stay away would make it wrong that the widow of Ferdinand Lopez should now assist at the marriage of one Wharton to another. This was all that a marriage ought to be, whereas that had been, all that a marriage ought not to be. In answer to the paragraph about Arthur Fletcher, Emily Lopez had not a word to say. Soon after this, early in April, Everett came up to town. Though his bride might be content to get her bridal clothes in Hereford, none but a London tailor could decorate him properly for such an occasion. During these last weeks Arthur Fletcher had not been seen in Manchester Square, nor had his name been mentioned there by Mr. Wharton. Of anything that may have passed between them Emily was altogether ignorant. She observed, or thought that she observed, that her father was more silent with her, perhaps less tender than he had been since the day on which her husband had perished. His manner of life was the same. He almost always dined at home in order that she might not be alone, and made no complaint as to her conduct. But she could see that he was unhappy, and she knew the cause of his grief. I think, Papa, she said one day, that it would be better that I should go away. This was on the day before Everett's arrival, of which, however, he had given no notice. Go away. Where would you go to? It does not matter. I do not make you happy. What do you mean? Who says that I am not happy? Why do you talk like that? Do not be angry with me. Nobody says so. I can see it well enough. I know how good you are to me, but I am making your life wretched. I am a wet blanket to you, and yet I cannot help myself. If I could only go somewhere where I could be of use. I don't know what you mean. This is your proper home. No, it is not my home. I ought to have forfeited it. I ought to go where I could work and be of some use in the world. You might be of use if you chose, my dear. Your proper career is before you if you would condescend to accept it. It is not for me to persuade you, but I can see and feel the truth. Till you bring yourself to do that, your days will be blighted, and so will mine. You have made one great mistake in life. Stop a moment. I do not speak often, but I wish you to listen to me now. Such mistakes do generally produce misery and ruin to all who are concerned. With you it chances that it may be otherwise. You can put your foot again upon the firm ground and recover everything. Of course there must be a struggle. One person has to struggle with circumstances, another with his foes, and a third with his own feelings. I can understand that there should be such a struggle with you, but it ought to be made. You ought to be brave enough and strong enough to conquer your regrets, and to begin again. In no other way can you do anything for me or for yourself. To talk of going away is childish nonsense. Whither would you go? I shall not urge you any more, but I would not have you talk to me in that way. Then he got up and left the room and the house, and went down to his club, in order that she might think of what he had said in solitude. And she did think of it. But still continually with an assurance to herself that her father did not understand her feelings. The career of which he spoke was no doubt open to her, but she could not regard it as that which it was proper that she should fulfill, as he did. When she told her lover that she had lain among the pots till she was black and defiled, she expressed in the strongest language that which was her real conviction. He did not think her to have been defiled, or at any rate thought that she might again bear the wings of a dove, but she felt it, and therefore knew herself to be unfit. She had said it all to her lover in the strongest words she could find, but she could not repeat them to her father. The next morning when he came into the parlour where she was already sitting, she looked up at him almost reproachfully. Did he think that a woman was a piece of furniture which you can mend, and revarnish, and fit out with new ornaments, and then send out for use, second-hand indeed, but for all purposes as good as new? Then, while she was in this frame of mind, Everett came in upon her unawares, and with his almost boisterous happiness succeeded for a while in changing the current of her thoughts. He was of course now uppermost in his own thoughts. The last few months had made so much of him that he might be excused for being unable to sink himself in the presence of others. He was the heir to the baronetcy, and to the double fortunes of the two old men. And he was going to be married in a manner as everyone told him to increase the glory and stability of the family. "It's all nonsense about your not coming down," he said. She smiled and shook her head. "I can only tell you that it will give the greatest offense to everyone. If you knew how much they talk about you down there I don't think you would like to hurt them." "Of course I would not like to hurt them. And considering that you have no other brother." "Oh, Everett. I think more about it, perhaps, than you do. I think you owe it me to come down. You will never probably have another chance of being present at your brother's marriage." This he said in a tone that was almost lachrymose. A wedding, Everett, should be merry. I don't know about that. It is a very serious sort of thing to my way of thinking. When Mary got your letter it nearly broke her heart. I think I have a right to expect it, and if you don't come I shall feel myself injured. I don't see what is the use of having a family if the members of it do not stick together. What would you think if I were to desert you? Desert you, Everett? Well, yes, it is something of the kind. I have made my request, and you can comply with it or not as you please. I will go, she said very slowly. Then she left him and went to her own room to think in what description of garment she could appear at a wedding with the least violence to the conditions of her life. "I have got her to say she'll come," he said to his father that evening. "If you leave her to me, I'll bring her round." Soon after that, within a day or two, there came out a paragraph in one of the fashionable newspapers of the day, saying that an alliance had been arranged between the heir to the Wharton title and property and the daughter of the present baronet. I think that this had probably originated in the club gossip. I trust it did not spring directly from the activity or ambition of Everett himself. Chapter 76. Who will it be? For the first day or two after the resignation of the ministry, the Duchess appeared to take no further notice of the matter. An ungrateful world had repudiated her and her husband, and he had foolishly assisted and given way to the repudiation. All her grand aspirations were at an end. All her triumphs were over. And worse than that, there was present to her a conviction that she never had really triumphed. There never had come the happy moment in which she had felt herself to be dominant over other women. She had toiled and struggled, she had battled and occasionally submitted. And yet there was present to her a feeling that she had stood higher in public estimation as Lady Glencora Palliser, whose position had been all her own and had not depended on her husband, than now she had done as Duchess of Omnium, and wife of the Prime Minister of England. She had meant to be something, she knew not what, greater than had been the wives of other prime ministers and other dukes, and now she felt that in her failure she had been almost ridiculous. And the failure, she thought, had been his, or hers, rather than that of circumstances. If he had been less scrupulous and more persistent it might have been different, or if she had been more discreet. Sometimes she felt her own failing so violently as to acquit him almost entirely. At other times she was almost beside herself with anger because all her losses seemed to have arisen from want of stubbornness on his part. When he had told her that he and his followers had determined to resign because they had beaten their foes by a majority only of 9, she took it into her head that he was in fault. Why should he go while his supporters were more numerous than his opponents? It was useless to bid him think it over again. Though she was far from understanding all the circumstances of the game, she did know that he could not remain after having arranged with his colleagues that he would go. So she became cross and sullen. And while he was going to Windsor and back and setting his house in order, and preparing the way for his successor, whoever that successor might be, she was moody and silent, dreaming over some impossible condition of things in accordance with which he might have remained Prime Minister, almost forever. On the Sunday after the fatal division, the division which the Duchess would not allow to have been fatal, she came across him somewhere in the house. She had hardly spoken to him since he had come into her room that night and told her that all was over. She had said that she was unwell and had kept out of sight. And he had been here and there, between Windsor and the Treasury Chambers, and had been glad to escape from her ill humor. But she could not endure any longer the annoyance of having to get all her news through Mrs. Finn, second hand, or third hand, and now found herself driven to capitulate. "Well," she said. "How is it all going to be? I suppose you do not know, or you would have told me?" "There is very little to tell." "Mr. Monk is to be Prime Minister?" she asked. "I did not say so. But it is not impossible." "Has the Queen sent for him?" "Not as yet. Her Majesty has seen both Mr. Gresham and Mr. Daubeny as well as myself. It does not seem a very easy thing to make a ministry just at present. Why should not you go back?" "I do not think that is on the cards." "Why not? Ever so many men have done it, after going out, and why not you? I remember Mr. Mildmay doing it twice. It is always the thing when the man who has been sent for makes a mess of it, for the old minister to have another chance. But what if the old minister will not take the chance? Then it is the old minister's fault. Why shouldn't you take the chance as well as another? It isn't many days ago since you were quite anxious to remain in. I thought you were going to break your heart because people even talked of your going." "I was going to break my heart, as you call it," he said, smiling, "not because people talked of my ceasing to be minister, but because the feeling of the House of Commons justified people in so saying. I hope you see the difference." "No, I don't. And there is no difference. The people we are talking about are the members, and they have supported you. You could go on if you chose. I'm sure Mr. Monk wouldn't leave you. It is just what Mr. Monk would do, and ought to do. No one is less likely than Mr. Monk to behave badly in such an emergency. The more I see of Mr. Monk, the higher I think of him. He has his own game to play as well as others. I think he has no game to play but that of his country. It is no use our discussing it, Cora. Of course I understand nothing, because I'm a woman. You understand a great deal, but not quite all. You may at any rate understand this, that our troubles are at an end. You were saying but the other day that the labors of being a Prime Minister's wife had been almost too many for you. I never said so. As long as you didn't give way, no labor was too much for me. I would have done anything, slaved morning and night, so that we might have succeeded. I hate being beat. I'd sooner be cut in pieces. There is no help for it now, Cora. The Lord Mayor, you know, is only Lord Mayor for 1 year, and must then go back to private life. But men have been Prime Ministers for 10 years at a time. If you have made up your mind, I suppose we may as well give up. I shall always think it your own fault. He still smiled. I shall, she said. Oh, Cora. I can only speak as I feel. I don't think you would speak as you do, if you knew how much your words hurt me. In such a matter as this I should not be justified in allowing your opinions to have weight with me. But your sympathy would be so much to me. When I thought it was making you ill, I wished that you might be spared. My illness would be nothing, but my honor is everything. I, too, have something to bear as well as you, and if you cannot approve of what I do, at any rate be silent. Yes, I can be silent. Then he slowly left her. As he went she was almost tempted to yield, and to throw herself into his arms, and to promise that she would be soft to him, and to say that she was sure that all he did was for the best. But she could not bring herself as yet to be good-humored. If he had only been a little stronger, a little thicker-skinned, made of clay a little coarser, a little other than he was, it might all have been so different. Early on that Sunday afternoon she had herself driven to Mrs. Finn's house in Park Lane, instead of waiting for her friend. Latterly she had but seldom done this, finding that her presence at home was much wanted. She had been filled with, perhaps, foolish ideas of the necessity of doing something, of adding something to the strength of her husband's position, and had certainly been diligent in her work. But now she might run about like any other woman. This is an honor, Duchess, said Mrs. Finn. Don't be sarcastic, Marie. We have nothing further to do with the bestowal of honors. Why didn't he make everybody a peer or a baronet while he was about it? Lord Finn. I don't see why he shouldn't have been Lord Finn. I'm sure he deserved it for the way in which he attacked Sir Timothy Beeswax. I don't think he'd like it. They all say so, but I suppose they do like it, or they wouldn't take it. And I'd have made Locock a knight, Sir James Locock. He'd make a more knightly knight than Sir Timothy. When a man has power he ought to use it. It makes people respect him. Mr. Daubeny made a duke, and people think more of that than anything he did. Is Mr. Finn going to join the new ministry? If you can tell me, Duchess, who is to be the new minister, I can give a guess. Mr. Monk. Then he certainly will. Or Mr. Daubeny. Then he certainly won't. Or Mr. Gresham. That I could not answer. Or the Duke of Omnium. That would depend upon his grace. If the Duke came back, Mr. Finn's services would be at his disposal, whether in or out of office. Very prettily said, my dear. I never look round this room without thinking of the first time I came here. Do you remember, when I found the old man sitting there? The old man alluded to was the late Duke. I am not likely to forget it, Duchess. How I hated you when I saw you. What a fright I thought you were. I pictured you to myself as a sort of ogre, willing to eat up everybody for the gratification of your own vanity. I was very vain, but there was a little pride with it. And now it has come to pass that I can't very well live without you. How he did love you. His Grace was very good to me. It would have done no great harm, after all, if he had made you Duchess of Omnium. Very great harm to me, Lady Glen. As it is I got a friend that I loved dearly, and a husband that I love dearly too. In the other case I should have had neither. Perhaps I may say, that in that other case my life would not have been brightened by the affection of the present Duchess. One can't tell how it would have gone, but I well remember the state I was in then. The door was opened and Phineas Finn entered the room. "What, Mr. Finn, are you at home? I thought everybody was crowding down at the clubs, to know who is to be what. We are settled. We are quiet. We have nothing to do to disturb ourselves. But you ought to be in all the flutter of renewed expectation. I am waiting my destiny in calm seclusion. I hope the Duke is well. As well as can be expected. He doesn't walk about his room with a poniard in his hand, ready for himself or Sir Orlando. Nor is he sitting crowned like Bacchus, drinking the health of the new ministry with Lord Drummond and Sir Timothy. He is probably sipping a cup of coffee over a blue book in dignified retirement. You should go and see him. I should be unwilling to trouble him when he is so much occupied. That is just what has done him all the harm in the world. Everybody presumes that he has so much to think of that nobody goes near him. Then he is left to brood over everything by himself till he becomes a sort of political hermit, or ministerial lama, whom human eyes are not to look upon. It doesn't matter now, does it? Visitor after visitor came in, and the Duchess chatted to them all, leaving the impression on everybody that heard her that she at least was not sorry to be relieved from the troubles attending her husband's late position. She sat there over an hour, and as she was taking her leave she had a few words to whisper to Mrs. Finn. "When this is all over," she said, "I mean to call on that Mrs. Lopez. I thought you did go there." That was soon after the poor man had killed himself, when she was going away. Of course I only left a card. But I shall see her now if I can. We want to get her out of her melancholy if possible. I have a sort of feeling, you know, that among us we made the train run over him. I don't think that. He got so horribly abused for what he did at Silverbridge, and I really don't see why he wasn't to have his money. It was I that made him spend it. He was, I fancy, a thoroughly bad man. But a wife doesn't always want to be made a widow even if her husband be bad. I think I owe her something, and I would pay my debt if I knew how. I shall go and see her, and if she will marry this other man we'll take her by the hand. Goodbye, dear. You'd better come to me early tomorrow, as I suppose we shall know something by 11 o'clock. In the course of that evening the Duke of St. Bungay came to Carlton Terrace and was closeted for some time with the late Prime Minister. He had been engaged during that and the last 2 previous days in lending his aid to various political maneuvers and ministerial attempts, from which our Duke had kept himself altogether aloof. He did not go to Windsor, but as each successive competitor journeyed thither and returned, someone either sent for the old Duke or went to seek his counsel. He was the Nestor of the occasion, and strove heartily to compose all quarrels, and so to arrange matters that a wholesome, moderately liberal ministry might be again installed for the good of the country and the comfort of all true Whigs. In such moments he almost ascended to the grand heights of patriotism, being always indifferent as to himself. Now he came to his late chief with a new project. Mr. Gresham would attempt to form a ministry if the Duke of Omnium would join him. "It is impossible," said the younger politician, folding his hands together and throwing himself back in his chair. "Listen to me before you answer me with such certainty. There are 3 or 4 gentlemen who, after the work of the last 3 years, bearing in mind the manner in which our defeat has just been accomplished, feel themselves disinclined to join Mr. Gresham unless you will do so also. I may specially name Mr. Monk and Mr. Finn. I might perhaps add myself, were it not that I had hoped that in any event I might at length regard myself as exempt from further service. The old horse should be left to graze out his last days, nepexit ad extremum ridendus. But you can't consider yourself absolved on that score. There are other reasons. But the Queen's service should count before everything. Gresham and Cantrip with their own friends can hardly make a ministry as things are now unless Mr. Monk will join them. I do not think that any other Chancellor of the Exchequer is at present possible. I will beseech Mr. Monk not to let any feeling as to me stand in his way. Why should it? It is not only what you may think and he may think, but what others will think and say. The coalition will have done all that ought to have been expected from it if our party in it can now join Mr. Gresham. By all means. But I could give them no strength. They may be sure at any rate of what little I can do for them out of office. Mr. Gresham has made his acceptance of office, well, I will not say strictly conditional on your joining him. That would hardly be correct. But he has expressed himself quite willing to make the attempt with your aid, and doubtful whether he can succeed without it. He suggests that you should join him as President of the Council. And you? If I were wanted at all I should take the Privy Seal. Certainly not, my friend. If there were any question of my return we would reverse the offices. But I think I may say that my mind is fixed. If you wish it I will see Mr. Monk, and do all that I can to get him to go with you. But for myself, I feel that it would be useless. At last, at the Duke's pressing request, he agreed to take 24 hours before he gave his final answer to the proposition. Chapter 77. The Duchess in Manchester Square. The Duke said not a word to his wife as to this new proposition, and when she asked him what tidings their old friend had brought as to the state of affairs, he almost told a fib in his anxiety to escape from her persecution. He is in some doubt what he means to do himself, said the Duke. The Duchess asked many questions, but got no satisfactory reply to any of them. Nor did Mrs. Finn learn anything from her husband, whom, however, she did not interrogate very closely. She would be contented to know when the proper time might come for ladies to be informed. The Duke, however, was determined to take his 24 hours all alone, or at any rate not to be driven to his decision by feminine interference. In the meantime the Duchess went to Manchester Square intent on performing certain good offices on behalf of the poor widow. It may be doubted whether she had clearly made up her mind what it was that she could do, though she was clear that some debt was due by her to Mrs. Lopez. And she knew too in what direction assistance might be serviceable, if only it could in this case be given. She had heard that the present member for Silverbridge had been the lady's lover long before Mr. Lopez had come upon the scene, and with those feminine wiles of which she was a perfect mistress she had extracted from him a confession that his mind was unaltered. She liked Arthur Fletcher, as indeed she had for a time liked Ferdinand Lopez, and felt that her conscience would be easier if she could assist in this good work. She built castles in the air as to the presence of the bride and bridegroom at Matching, thinking how she might thus repair the evil she had done. But her heart misgave her a little as she drew near to the house, and remembered how very slight was her acquaintance and how extremely delicate the mission on which she had come. But she was not the woman to turn back when she had once put her foot to any work, and she was driven up to the door in Manchester Square without any expressed hesitation on her own part. Yes, his mistress was at home, said the butler, still shrinking at the sound of the name which he hated. The Duchess was then shown upstairs, and was left alone for some minutes in the drawing-room. It was a large handsome apartment, hung round with valuable pictures, and having signs of considerable wealth. Since she had first invited Lopez to stand for Silverbridge she had heard much about him, and had wondered how he had gained possession of such a girl as Emily Wharton. And now, as she looked about, her wonder was increased. She knew enough of such people as the Whartons and the Fletchers to be aware that as a class they are more impregnable, more closely guarded by their feelings and prejudices against strangers than any other. None keep their daughters to themselves with greater care, or are less willing to see their rules of life changed or abolished. And yet this man, half foreigner half Jew, and as it now appeared, whole pauper, had stepped in and carried off a prize for which such a one as Arthur Fletcher was contending. The Duchess had never seen Emily but once, so as to observe her well, and had then thought her to be a very handsome woman. It had been at the garden party at Richmond, and Lopez had then insisted that his wife should be well dressed. It would perhaps have been impossible in the whole of that assembly to find a more beautiful woman than Mrs. Lopez then was, or one who carried herself with a finer air. Now when she entered the room in her deep mourning it would have been difficult to recognize her. Her face was much thinner, her eyes apparently larger, and her color faded. And there had come a settled seriousness on her face which seemed to rob her of her youth. Arthur Fletcher had declared that as he saw her now she was more beautiful than ever. But Arthur Fletcher, in looking at her, saw more than her mere features. To his eyes there was a tenderness added by her sorrow which had its own attraction for him. And he was so well versed in every line of her countenance, that he could see there the old loveliness behind the sorrow. The loveliness which would come forth again, as bright as ever, if the sorrow could be removed. But the Duchess, though she remembered the woman's beauty as she might that of any other lady, now saw nothing but a thing of woe wrapped in customary widow's weeds. "I hope," she said, "I am not intruding in coming to you, but I have been anxious to renew our acquaintance for reasons which I am sure you will understand." Emily at the moment hardly knew how to address her august visitor. Though her father had lived all his life in what is called good society, he had not consorted much with dukes and duchesses. She herself had indeed on one occasion been for an hour or two the guest of this grand lady, but on that occasion she had hardly been called upon to talk to her. Now she doubted how to name the Duchess, and with some show of hesitation decided at last upon not naming her at all. "It is very good of you to come," she said in a faltering voice. "I told you that I would when I wrote, you know. That is many months ago, but I have not forgotten it. You have been in the country since that, I think?" "Yes, in Herefordshire. Herefordshire is our county." "I know all about it," said the Duchess, smiling. She generally did contrive to learn all about the people whom she chose to take by the hand. "We have a Herefordshire gentleman sitting for, I must not say our borough of Silverbridge." She was anxious to make some allusion to Arthur Fletcher. But it was difficult to travel on that Silverbridge ground, as Lopez had been her chosen candidate when she still wished to claim the borough as an appanage of the Palliser family. Emily, however, kept her countenance and did not show by any sign that her thoughts were running in that direction. "And though we don't presume to regard Mr. Fletcher," continued the Duchess, "as in any way connected with our local interests, he has always supported the Duke, and I hope has become a friend of ours. I think he is a neighbor of yours in the country." "Oh, yes. My cousin is married to his brother." "I knew there was something of that kind. He told me that there was some close alliance." The Duchess, as she looked at the woman to whom she wanted to be kind, did not as yet dare to express a wish that there might at some not very distant time be a closer alliance. She had come there intending to do so, and had still some hope that she might do it before the interview was over. But at any rate she would not do it yet. "Have I not heard," she said, "something of another marriage? My brother is going to marry his cousin, Sir Alyard Wharton's daughter." "Ah, I thought it had been one of the Fletchers." "It was our member who told me, and he spoke as though they were all his very dear friends." "They are dear friends, very." Poor Emily still didn't know whether to call her Duchess, my lady, or your Grace, and yet felt the need of calling her by some special name. "Exactly. I supposed it was so. They tell me Mr. Fletcher will become quite a favorite in the house. At this present moment nobody knows on which side anybody is going to sit tomorrow. It may be that Mr. Fletcher will become the dire enemy of all the Duke's friends. I hope not. Of course I'm speaking of political enemies. Political enemies are often the best friends in the world. And I can assure you from my own experience that political friends are often the bitterest enemies. I never hated any people so much as some of our supporters." The Duchess made a grimace, and Emily could not refrain from smiling. "Yes, indeed. There's an old saying that misfortune makes strange bedfellows, but political friendship makes stranger alliances than misfortune. Perhaps you never met Sir Timothy Beeswax?" "Never." "Well, don't. But, as I was saying, there is no knowing who may support whom now. If I were asked who would be Prime Minister tomorrow, I should take half a dozen names and shake them in a bag. It is not settled then? Settled? No, indeed. Nothing is settled. At that moment indeed everything was settled, though the Duchess did not know it. And so we none of us can tell how Mr. Fletcher may stand with us when things are arranged. I suppose he calls himself a Conservative? Oh, yes. All the Whartons, I suppose, are Conservatives, and all the Fletchers. Very nearly. Papa calls himself a Tory. A very much better name, to my thinking. We are all Whigs, of course. A Palliser who was not a Whig would be held to have disgraced himself forever. Are not politics odd? A few years ago I only barely knew what the word meant, and that not correctly. Lately I have been so eager about it, that there hardly seems to be anything else left worth living for. I suppose it's wrong, but a state of pugnacity seems to me the greatest bliss which we can reach here on earth. I shouldn't like to be always fighting. That's because you haven't known Sir Timothy Beeswax and 2 or 3 other gentlemen whom I could name. The day will come, I dare say, when you will care for politics. Emily was about to answer, hardly knowing what to say, when the door was opened and Mrs. Roby came into the room. The lady was not announced, and Emily had heard no knock at the door. She was forced to go through some ceremony of introduction. "This is my aunt, Mrs. Roby," she said. "Aunt Harriet, the Duchess of Omnium." Mrs. Roby was beside herself, not all with joy. That feeling would come afterwards as she would boast to her friends of her new acquaintance. At present there was the embarrassment of not quite knowing how to behave herself. The Duchess bowed from her seat, and smiled sweetly, as she had learned to smile since her husband had become Prime Minister. Mrs. Roby curtsied, and then remembered that in these days only housemaids ought to curtsy. "Anything to our Mr. Roby," said the Duchess, continuing her smile, "ours as he was till yesterday at least." This she said in an absurd wail of mock sorrow. "My brother-in-law, your Grace," said Mrs. Roby, delighted. "Oh indeed. And what does Mr. Roby think about it, I wonder? But I dare say you have found, Mrs. Roby, that when a crisis comes, a real crisis, the ladies are told nothing." "I have. I don't think, your Grace, that Mr. Roby ever divulges political secrets." "Doesn't he indeed? What a dull man your brother-in-law must be to live with, that is as a politician. Goodbye, Mrs. Lopez. You must come and see me and let me come to you again. I hope, I hope the time may come when things may once more be bright with you." These last words she murmured almost in a whisper, as she held the hand of the woman she wished to befriend. Then she bowed to Mrs. Roby, and left the room. "What was it she said to you?" asked Mrs. Roby. "Nothing in particular, Aunt Harriet. She seems to be very friendly." "What made her come?" "She wrote some time ago to say she would call." "But why?" "I cannot tell you. I don't know. Don't ask me, Aunt, about things that are past. You cannot do it without wounding me." "I don't want to wound you, Emily, but I really think that is nonsense. She is a very nice woman, though I don't think she ought to have said that Mr. Roby is dull." "Did Mr. Wharton know that she was coming?" "He knew that she said she would come," replied Emily very sternly, so that Mrs. Roby found herself compelled to pass on to some other subject. Mrs. Roby had heard the wish expressed that something once more might be bright, and when she got home told her husband that she was sure that Emily Lopez was going to marry Arthur Fletcher. "And why the d— shouldn't she?" said Dick. "And that poor man destroying himself not much more than 12 months ago." "I couldn't do it," said Mrs. Roby. "I don't mean to give you the chance," said Dick. The Duchess when she went away suffered under a sense of failure. She had intended to bring about some crisis of female tenderness in which she might have rushed into future hopes and joyous anticipations. and with the freedom which will come from ebullitions of feeling, have told the widow that the peculiar circumstances of her position would not only justify her in marrying this other man but absolutely called upon her to do it. Unfortunately she had failed in her attempt to bring the interview to a condition in which this would have been possible, and while she was still making the attempt that odious aunt had come in. "I have been on my mission," she said to Mrs. Finn afterwards. "Have you done any good?" "I don't think I've done any harm. Women, you know, are so very different. There are some who would delight to have an opportunity of opening their hearts to a duchess, and who might almost be talked into anything in an ecstasy. Hardly women of the best sort, Lady Glen. Not of the best sort. But then one doesn't come across the very best, very often. But that kind of thing does have an effect. And as I only wanted to do good, I wish she had been one of the sort for the occasion." "Was she offended?" "Oh dear, no. You don't suppose I attacked her with a husband at the first word? Indeed, I didn't attack her at all. She didn't give me an opportunity. Such a Niobe you never saw." "Was she weeping?" "Not actual tears. But her gown, and her cap, and her strings were weeping. Her voice wept, and her hair, and her nose, and her mouth. Don't you know that look of subdued mourning? And yet they say that that man is dying for love. How beautiful it is to see that there is such a thing as constancy left in the world." When she got home she found that her husband had just returned from the old Duke's house, where he had met Mr. Monk, Mr. Gresham, and Lord Cantrip. "It's all settled at last," he said cheerfully. Chapter 78. The New Ministry. When the ex-Prime Minister was left by himself after the departure of his old friend, his first feeling had been one of regret that he had been weak enough to doubt at all. He had long since made up his mind that after all that had passed he could not return to office as a subordinate. That feeling as to the impropriety of Caesar descending to serve under others which he had been foolish enough to express, had been strong with him from the very commencement of his ministry. When first asked to take the place which he had filled, the reason strong against it had been the conviction that it would probably exclude him from political work during the latter half of his life. The man who has written QC after his name must abandon his practice behind the bar. As he then was, although he had already been driven by the unhappy circumstance of his peerage from the House of Commons which he loved so well, there were still open to him many fields of political work. But if he should once consent to stand on the top rung of the ladder, he could not, he thought, take a lower place without degradation. Till he should have been placed quite at the top, no shifting his place from this higher to that lower office would injure him in his own estimation. The exigencies of the service and not defeat would produce such changes as that. But he could not go down from being Prime Minister and serve under some other chief without acknowledging himself to have been unfit for the place he had filled. Of all that he had quite assured himself. And yet he had allowed the old Duke to talk him into a doubt. As he sat considering the question he acknowledged that there might have been room for doubt, though in the present emergency there certainly was none. He could imagine circumstances in which the experience of an individual in some special branch of his country's service might be of such paramount importance to the country as to make it incumbent on a man to sacrifice all personal feeling. But it was not so with him. There was nothing now which he could do, which another might not do as well. That blessed task of introducing decimals into all the commercial relations of British life, which had once kept him aloft in the air, floating as upon eagle's wings, had been denied him. If ever done, it must be done from the House of Commons, and the people of the country had become deaf to the charms of that great reform. Othello's occupation was, in truth, altogether gone, and there was no reason by which he could justify to himself the step down in the world which the old Duke had proposed to him. Early on the following morning he left Carlton Terrace on foot and walked as far as Mr. Monk's house, which was close to St. James's Street. Here at 11 o'clock he found his late Chancellor of the Exchequer in that state of tedious agitation in which a man is kept who does not yet know whether he is or is not to be one of the actors in the play just about to be performed. The Duke had never before been in Mr. Monk's very humble abode, and now caused some surprise. Mr. Monk knew that he might probably be sent for, but had not expected that any of the ex-prime ministers of the day would come to him. People had said that not improbably he himself might be the man, but he himself had indulged in no such dream. Office had had no great charms for him. And if there was one man of the late government who could lay it down without a personal regret, it was Mr. Monk. "I wish you to come with me to the Duke's house in St. James's Square," said the late Prime Minister. "I think we shall find him at home." "Certainly. I will come this moment." Then there was not a word spoken till the two men were in the street together. "Of course I am a little anxious," said Mr. Monk. "Have you anything to tell me before we get there?" "You of course must return to office, Mr. Monk." "With your grace, I certainly will do so." "And without, if there be the need. They who are wanted should be forthcoming. But perhaps you will let me postpone what I have to say till we see the Duke. What a charming morning, is it not? How sweet it would be down in the country." March had gone out like a lamb, and even in London the early April days were sweet, to be followed, no doubt, by the usual nipping inclemency of May. "I never can get over the feeling," continued the Duke, "that Parliament should sit for the 6 winter months, instead of in summer. If we met on the 1st of October, how glorious it would be to get away for the early spring." "Nothing less strong than grouse could break up Parliament," said Mr. Monk. "And then what would the pheasants and the foxes say? It is giving up almost too much to our amusements. I used to think that I should like to move for a return of the number of hunting and shooting gentlemen in both houses. I believe it would be a small minority. But their sons shoot, and their daughters hunt, and all their hangers-on would be against it. Custom is against us, Mr. Monk, that is it. Here we are. I hope my friend will not be out, looking up young lords of the Treasury." The Duke of St. Bungay was not in search of cadets for the government, but was at this very moment closeted with Mr. Gresham, and Mr. Gresham's especial friend Lord Cantrip. He had been at this work so long and so constantly that his very servants had their ministerial crisis manners and felt and enjoyed the importance of the occasion. The two newcomers were soon allowed to enter the august conclave, and the 5 great senators greeted each other cordially. "I hope we have not come inopportunely," said the Duke of Omnium. Mr. Gresham assured him almost with hilarity that nothing could be less inopportune, and then the Duke was sure that Mr. Gresham was to be the new Prime Minister, whoever might join him or whoever might refuse to do so. "I told my friend here," continued our Duke, laying his hand upon the old man's arm, "that I would give him his answer to a proposition he made me within 24 hours. But I find that I can do so without that delay." "I trust your Grace's answer may be favourable to us," said Mr. Gresham, who indeed did not doubt much that it would be so, seeing that Mr. Monk had accompanied him. "I do not think that it will be unfavourable, though I cannot do as my friend has proposed." "Any practicable arrangement," began Mr. Gresham, with a frown, however, on his brow. "The most practicable arrangement, I am sure, will be for you to form your government without hampering yourself with a beaten predecessor." "Not beaten," said Lord Cantrip. "Certainly not," said the other Duke. "It is because of your success that I ask your services," said Mr. Gresham. "I have none to give, none that I cannot better bestow out of office than in. I must ask you, gentlemen, to believe that I am quite fixed. Coming here with my friend Mr. Monk, I did not state my purpose to him, but I begged him to accompany me, fearing lest in my absence he should feel it incumbent on himself to sail in the same boat with his late colleague." "I should prefer to do so," said Mr. Monk. "Of course it is not for me to say what may be Mr. Gresham's ideas, but as my friend here suggested to me that, were I to return to office, Mr. Monk would do so also, I cannot be wrong in surmising that his services are desired." Mr. Gresham bowed assent. "I shall therefore take the liberty of telling Mr. Monk that I think he is bound to give his aid in the present emergency." Were I as happily placed as he is in being the possessor of a seat in the House of Commons, I too should hope that I might do something. The four gentlemen, with eager pressure, begged the Duke to reconsider his decision. He could take this office and do nothing in it, there being, as we all know, offices the holders of which are not called upon for work, or he could take that place which would require him to labor like a galley slave. Would he be Privy Seal? Would he undertake the India Board? But the Duke of Omnium was at last resolute. Of this administration he would not at any rate be a member. Whether Caesar might or might not at some future time condescend to command a legion, he could not do so when the purple had been but that moment stripped from his shoulders. He soon afterwards left the house with a repeated request to Mr. Monk that he would not follow his late chief's example. "I regret it greatly," said Mr. Gresham when he was gone. "There is no man," said Lord Cantrip, "whom all who know him more thoroughly respect." "He has been worried," said the old Duke, "and must take time to recover himself. He has but one fault, he is a little too conscientious, a little too scrupulous." Mr. Monk, of course, did join them, making one or two stipulations as he did so. He required that his friend Phineas Finn should be included in the government. Mr. Gresham yielded, though poor Phineas was not among the most favoured friends of that statesman. And so the government was formed, and the crisis was again over. And the lists which all the newspapers had been publishing for the last 3 days were republished in an amended and nearly correct condition. The triumph of the People's Banner, as to the omission of the Duke, was of course complete. The editor had no hesitation in declaring that he, by his own sagacity and persistency, had made certain the exclusion of that very unfit and very pressing candidate for office. The list was filled up after the usual fashion. For a while the dilettante politicians of the clubs, and the strong-minded women who take an interest in such things, and the writers in newspapers, had almost doubted whether, in the emergency which had been supposed to be so peculiar, any government could be formed. There had been, so they had said, peculiarities so peculiar that it might be that the much-dreaded deadlock had come at last. A coalition had been possible and, though antagonistic to British feelings generally, had carried on the government. But what might succeed the coalition, nobody had known. The Radicals and Liberals together would be too strong for Mr. Daubeny and Sir Orlando. Mr. Gresham had no longer a party of his own at his back, and a second coalition would be generally spurned. In this way there had been much political excitement, and a fair amount of consequent enjoyment. But after a few days the old men had rattled into their old places, or, generally, old men into new places, and it was understood that Mr. Gresham would be again supported by a majority. As we grow old it is a matter of interest to watch how the natural gaps are filled in the two ranks of parliamentary workmen by whom the government is carried on, either in the one interest or the other. Of course there must be gaps. Some men become too old, though that is rarely the case. A Peel may perish, or even a Palmerston must die. Some men, though long supported by interest, family connection, or the loyalty of colleagues, are weighed down at last by their own incapacity and sink into peerages. Now and again a man cannot bear the bondage of office, and flies into rebellion and independence which would have been more respectable had it not been the result of discontent. Then the gaps must be filled. Whether on this side or on that, the candidates are first looked for among the sons of earls and dukes, and not unnaturally. As the sons of earls and dukes may be educated for such work almost from their infancy. A few rise by the slow process of acknowledged fitness, men who probably at first have not thought of office but are chosen because they are wanted, and whose careers are grudged them. Not by their opponents or rivals, but by the Browns and Joneses of the world who cannot bear to see a Smith or a Walker become something so different to themselves. These men have a great weight to carry, and cannot always shake off the burden of their origin and live among begotten statesmen as though they too had been born to the manor. But perhaps the most wonderful ministerial phenomenon, though now almost too common to be longer called a phenomenon, is he who rises high in power and place by having made himself thoroughly detested and also, alas for parliamentary cowardice. Thoroughly feared. Given sufficient audacity, a thick skin, and power to bear for a few years the evil looks and cold shoulders of his comrades, and that is the man most sure to make his way to some high seat. But the skin must be thicker than that of any animal known, and the audacity must be complete. To the man who will once shrink at the idea of being looked at askance for treachery, or hated for his ill condition, the career is impossible. But let him be obdurate, and the bid will come. Not because I want him, do I ask for him, says some groaning chief of a party, to himself, and also sufficiently aloud for others' ears, but because he stings me and goads me, and will drive me to madness as a foe. Then the pachydermatous one enters into the other's heaven, probably with the resolution already formed of ousting that unhappy angel. And so it was in the present instance. When Mr. Gresham's completed list was published to the world was astonished to find that Sir Timothy was to be Mr. Gresham's Attorney General. Sir Gregory Grogram became Lord Chancellor, and the Liberal chief was content to borrow his senior law adviser from the Conservative side of the late coalition. It could not be that Mr. Gresham was very fond of Sir Timothy, but Sir Timothy in the late debates had shown himself to be a man of whom a minister might well be afraid. Immediately on leaving the old Duke's house, the late Premier went home to his wife, and, finding that she was out, waited for her return. Now that he had put his own decision beyond his own power, he was anxious to let her know how it was to be with them. "I think it is settled at last," he said. "And you are coming back?" "Certainly not that. I believe I may say that Mr. Gresham is Prime Minister." "Then he oughtn't to be," said the Duchess crossly. "I am sorry that I must differ from you, my dear, because I think he is the fittest man in England for the place." "And you?" "I am a private gentleman who will now be able to devote more of his time to his wife and children than has hitherto been possible with him." "How very nice. Do you mean to say that you like it?" "I am sure that I ought to like it. At the present moment I am thinking more of what you will like. If you ask me, Plantagenet, you know I shall tell the truth." "Then tell the truth." "After drinking brandy so long I hardly think that 12's claret will agree with my stomach." "You ask for the truth, and there it is, very plainly." "Plain enough. You asked, you know. And I am glad to have been told, even though that which you tell me is not pleasant hearing. When a man has been drinking too much brandy, it may be well that he should be put on a course of 12's claret. He won't like it, and then, it's kill or cure. I don't think you're gone so far, Cora, that we need fear that the remedy will be fatal. I am thinking of you rather than myself. I can make myself generally disagreeable, and get excitement in that way. But what will you do? It's all very well to talk of me and the children, but you can't bring in a bill for reforming us. You can't make us go by decimals. You can't increase our consumption by lowering our taxation. I wish you had gone back to some board." This she said looking up into his face with an anxiety which was half real and half burlesque. "I had made up my mind to go back to no board, for the present. I was thinking that we could spend some months in Italy, Cora." "What, for the summer, so as to be in Rome in July? After that we could utilize the winter by visiting Norway." "We might take Norway first. And be eaten up by mosquitoes. I've got to be too old to like traveling." "What do you like, dear?" "Nothing, except being the Prime Minister's wife. And upon my word there were times when I didn't like that very much. I don't know anything else that I'm fit for. I wonder whether Mr. Gresham would let me go to him as housekeeper? Only we should have to lend him Gatherum, or there would be no room for the display of my abilities." "Is Mr. Monk in?" "He keeps his old office." "And Mr. Finn?" "I believe so. But in what place I don't know." "And who else?" "Our old friend the Duke, and Lord Cantrip, and Mr. Wilson, and Sir Gregory will be Lord Chancellor. Just the old stupid Liberal team. Put their names in a bag and shake them, and you can always get a ministry." Well, Plantagenet, I'll go anywhere you like to take me. I'll have something for the malaria at Rome, and something for the mosquitoes in Norway, and we'll make the best of it. But I don't see why you should run away in the middle of the session. I would stay and pitch into them, all round, like a true ex-minister and independent member of Parliament. Then as he was leaving her she fired a last shot. I hope you made Sir Orlando and Sir Timothy peers before you gave up. It was not till 2 days after this that she read in one of the daily papers that Sir Timothy Beeswax was to be Attorney General, and then her patience almost deserted her. To tell the truth, her husband had not dared to mention the appointment when he first saw her after hearing it. Her explosion first fell on the head of Phineas Finn, whom she found at home with his wife. Deploring the necessity which had fallen upon him of filling the fainéant office of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. "Mr. Finn," she said, "I congratulate you on your colleagues. Your Grace is very good. I was at any rate introduced to many of them under the Duke's auspices. And ought, I think, to have seen enough of them to be ashamed of them. Such a regiment to march through Coventry with. I do not doubt that we shall be good enough men for any enemies we may meet. It cannot but be that you should conquer all the world with such a hero among you as Sir Timothy Beeswax. The idea of Sir Timothy coming back again. What do you feel about it?" "Very indifferent, Duchess. He won't interfere much with me, as I have an Attorney General of my own. You see I'm especially safe." "I do believe men would do anything," said the Duchess, turning to Mrs. Finn. "Of course I mean in the way of politics. But I did not think it possible that the Duke of St. Bungay should again be in the same government with Sir Timothy Beeswax." Chapter 79. The Wharton Wedding. It was at last settled that the Wharton marriage should take place during the second week in June. There were various reasons for the postponement. In the first place, Mary Wharton, after a few preliminary inquiries, found herself forced to declare that Messrs. Muddox and Cramble could not send her forth equipped as she ought to be equipped for such a husband in so short a time. "Perhaps they do it quicker in London," she said to Everett with a soft regret, remembering the metropolitan glories of her sister's wedding. And then Arthur Fletcher could be present during the Whitsuntide holidays, and the presence of Arthur Fletcher was essential. And it was not only his presence at the altar that was needed. Parliament was not so exacting but that he might have given that. But it was considered by the united families to be highly desirable that he should on this occasion remain some days in the country. Emily had promised to attend the wedding, and would of course be at Wharton for at least a week. As soon as Everett had succeeded in wresting a promise from his sister, the tidings were conveyed to Fletcher. It was a great step gained. When in London she was her own mistress. But surrounded as she would be down in Herefordshire by Fletchers and Whartons, she must be stubborn indeed if she should still refuse to be taken back into the flock. And be made once more happy by marrying the man whom she confessed that she loved with her whole heart. The letter to Arthur Fletcher containing the news was from his brother John, and was written in a very businesslike fashion. "We have put off Mary's marriage a few days, so that you and she should be down here together. If you mean to go on with it, now is your time." Arthur, in answer to this, merely said he would spend the Whitsuntide holidays at Longbarns. It is probable that Emily herself had some idea in her own mind of what was being done to entrap her. Her brother's words to her had been so strong, and the occasion of his marriage was itself so sacred to her, that she had not been able to refuse his request. But from the moment that she had made the promise, she felt that she had greatly added to her own difficulties. That she could yield to Arthur never occurred to her. She was certain of her own persistency. Whatever might be the wishes of others. The fitness of things required that Arthur Fletcher's wife should not have been the widow of Ferdinand Lopez, and required also that the woman who had married Ferdinand Lopez should bear the results of her own folly. Though since his death she had never spoken a syllable against him, if those passionate words be accepted which Arthur himself had drawn from her, still she had not refrained from acknowledging the truth to herself. He had been a man disgraced, and she as his wife, having become his wife in opposition to the wishes of all her friends, was disgraced also. Let them do what they will with her, she would not soil Arthur Fletcher's name with this infamy. Such was still her steadfast resolution. But she knew that it would be, not endangered, but increased in difficulty by this visit to Herefordshire. And then there were other troubles. "Papa," she said, "I must get a dress for Everett's marriage." "Why not?" "I can't bear, after all that I have cost you, putting you to such useless expense." "It is not useless, and such expenses as that I can surely afford without groaning. Do it handsomely and you will please me best." Then she went forth and chose her dress, a grey silk, light enough not to throw quite a gloom on the brightness of the day, and yet dark enough to declare that she was not as other women are. The very act of purchasing this, almost blushing at her own request as she sat at the counter in her widow's weeds, was a pain to her. But she had no one whom she could employ. On such an occasion she could not ask her Aunt Harriet to act for her, as her aunt was distrusted and disliked. And then there was the fitting on of the dress, very grievous to her, as it was the first time since the heavy black morning came home that she had clothed herself in other garments. The day before that fixed for the marriage she and her father went down to Herefordshire together, the conversation on the way being all in respect to Everett. Where was he to live? What was he to do? What income would he require till he should inherit the good things which destiny had in store for him? The old man seemed to feel that Providence, having been so very good to his son in killing that other heir, had put rather a heavy burden on himself. "He'll want a house of his own, of course," he said, in a somewhat lachrymose tone. "I suppose he'll spend a good deal of his time at Wharton. He won't be content to live in another man's house altogether, my dear, and Sir Alyard can allow him nothing. It means, of course, that I must give him 1,000 a year. It seems very natural to him, I dare say, but he might have asked the question before he took a wife to himself. You won't be angry with him, Papa?" "It's no good being angry." "No, I'm not angry. Only it seems that everybody is uncommonly well pleased without thinking who has to pay for the piper." On that evening, at Wharton, Emily still wore her morning dress. No one, indeed, dared to speak to her on the subject, and Mary was even afraid lest she might appear in black on the following day. We all know in what condition is a house on the eve of a marriage, how the bride feels that all the world is going to be changed, and that therefore everything is for the moment disjointed. And how the rest of the household, including the servants, are led to share the feeling. Everett was of course away. He was over at Longbarns with the Fletchers, and was to be brought to Wharton Church on the following morning. Old Mrs. Fletcher was at Wharton Hall, and the bishop, whose services had been happily secured. He was formally introduced to Mrs. Lopez, the use of the name for the occasion being absolutely necessary, and with all the smiling urbanity which as a bishop he was bound to possess. He was hardly able not to be funereal as he looked at her and remembered her story. Before the evening was over Mrs. Fletcher did venture to give a hint. "We are so glad you have come, my dear. I could not stay away when Everett said he wished it. It would have been wrong." "Yes, my dear, wrong. It is your duty, and the duty of us all, to subordinate our feelings to those of others. Even sorrow may be selfish." Poor Emily listened but could make no reply. It is sometimes harder for us to be mindful of others in our grief than in our joy. You should remember, dear, that there are some who will never be light-hearted again till they see you smile. Do not say that, Mrs. Fletcher. It is quite true, and right that you should think of it. It will be particularly necessary that you should think of it tomorrow. You will have to wear a light dress, Anne. "I have come provided," said the widow. "Try then to make your heart as light as your frock. You will be doing it for Everett's sake, and for your father's, and for Mary's sake, and Arthur's. You will be doing it for the sake of all of us on a day that should be joyous." She could not make any promise in reply to this homily, but in her heart of hearts she acknowledged that it was true, and declared to herself that she would make the effort required of her. On the following morning the house was of course in confusion. There was to be a breakfast after the service, and after the breakfast the bride was to be taken away in a carriage and four as far as Hereford on her route to Paris. But before the great breakfast there was of course a subsidiary breakfast, or how could bishop, bride, or bridesmaids have sustained the ceremony? At this meal Emily did not appear, having begged for a cup of tea in her own room. The carriages to take the party to the church, which was but the other side of the park, were ordered at 11, and at 11:15 she appeared for the first time in her grey silk dress. And without a widow's cap. Everything was very plain, but the alteration was so great that it was impossible not to look at her. Even her father had not seen the change before. Not a word was said, though old Mrs. Fletcher's thanks were implied by the graciousness of her smile. As there were 4 bridesmaids and 4 other ladies besides the bride herself, in a few minutes she became obscured by the brightness of the others. And then they were all packed in their carriages and taken to the church. The eyes which she most dreaded did not meet hers till they were all standing round the altar. It was only then that she saw Arthur Fletcher, who was there as her brother's best man, and it was then that he took her hand and held it for half a minute as though he never meant to part with it. Hidden behind the widespread glories of the bridesmaids' finery. The marriage was as sweet and solemn as a kind-hearted bishop could make it, and all the ladies looked particularly well. The veil from London, with the orange wreath, also metropolitan, was perfect, and as for the dress, I doubt whether any woman would have known it to be provincial. Everett looked the rising baronet, every inch of him, and the old barrister smiled and seemed, at least, to be well pleased. Then came the breakfast, and the speech-making, in which Arthur Fletcher shone triumphantly. It was a very nice wedding, and Mary Wharton, as she had been and still was, felt herself for a moment to be a heroine. But, through it all, there was present to the hearts of most of them a feeling that much more was to be effected, if possible, than this simple and cosy marriage. And that the fate of Mary Wharton was hardly so important to them as that of Emily Lopez. When the carriage and 4 was gone there came upon the household the difficulty usual on such occasions of getting through the rest of the day. The bridesmaids retired and repacked their splendors so that they might come out fresh for other second-rate needs, and with the bridesmaids went the widow. Arthur Fletcher remained at Wharton with all the other Fletchers for the night, and was prepared to renew his suit on that very day, if an opportunity were given him. But Emily did not again show herself till a few minutes before dinner, and then she came down with all the appurtenances of mourning which she usually wore. The grey silk had been put on for the marriage ceremony and for that only. "You should have kept your dress at any rate for the day," said Mrs. Fletcher. She replied that she had changed it for Everett, and that as Everett was gone there was no further need for her to wear clothes unfitted to her position. Arthur would have cared very little for the clothes could he have had his way with the woman who wore them, could he have had his way even so far as to have found himself alone with her for half an hour. But no such chance was his. She retreated from the party early, and did not show herself on the following morning till after he had started for Longbarns. All the Fletchers went back, not, however, with any intention on the part of Arthur to abandon his immediate attempt. The distance between the houses was not so great but that he could drive himself over at any time. "I shall go now," he said to Mr. Wharton, "because I have promised John to fish with him tomorrow, but I shall come over on Monday or Tuesday, and stay till I go back to town. I hope she will at any rate let me speak to her." The father said he would do his best, but that obstinate resumption of her weeds on her brother's very wedding day had nearly broken his heart. When the Fletchers were back at Longbarns, the 2 ladies were very severe on her. "It was downright obstinacy," said the squire's wife, "and it almost makes me think it would serve her right to leave her as she is." "It's pride," said the old lady. "She won't give way. I said ever so much to her, but it's no use. I feel it the more because we have all gone so much out of the way to be good to her after she had made such a fool of herself. If it goes on much longer, I shall never forgive her again." "You'll have to forgive her, mother," said her eldest son, "let her sins be what they may, or else you'll have to quarrel with Arthur." "I do think it's very hard," said the old lady, taking herself out of the room. And it was hard. The offense in the first instance had been very great, and the forgiveness very difficult. But Mrs. Fletcher had lived long enough to know that when sons are thoroughly respectable, a widowed mother has to do their bidding. Emily, through the whole wedding day, and the next day, and day after day, remembered Mrs. Fletcher's words. "There are some who will never be light-hearted again till they see you smile." And the old woman had named her dearest friends, and had ended by naming Arthur Fletcher. She had then acknowledged to herself that it was her duty to smile in order that others might smile also. But how is one to smile with a heavy heart? Should one smile and lie? And how long and to what good purpose can such forced contentment last? She had marred her whole life. In former days she had been proud of all her virgin glories, proud of her intellect, proud of her beauty, proud of that obeisance which beauty, birth, and intellect combined, exact from all comers. She had been ambitious as to her future life, had intended to be careful not to surrender herself to some empty fool, had thought herself well qualified to pick her own steps. And this had come of it. They told her that she might still make everything right, annul the past and begin the world again as fresh as ever, if she would only smile and study to forget. "Do it for the sake of others," they said, "and then it will be done for yourself also." But she could not conquer the past. The fire and water of repentance, adequate as they may be for eternity, cannot burn out or wash away the remorse of this life. They scorch and choke, and unless it be so there is no repentance. So she told herself, and yet it was her duty to be light-hearted that others around her might not be made miserable by her sorrow. If she could be in truth light-hearted, then would she know herself to be unfeeling and worthless. On the third day after the marriage Arthur Fletcher came back to Wharton with the declared intention of remaining there till the end of the holidays. She could make no objection to such an arrangement, nor could she hasten her own return to London. That had been fixed before her departure and was to be made together with her father. She felt that she was being attacked with unfair weapons, and that undue advantage was taken of the sacrifice which she had made for her brother's sake. And yet how good to her they all were. How wonderful was it that after the thing she had done, after the disgrace she had brought on herself and them, after the destruction of all that pride which had once been hers, they should still wish to have her among them. As for him, of whom she was always thinking, of what nature must be his love, when he was willing to take to himself as his wife such a thing as she had made herself. But, thinking of this, she would only tell herself that as he would not protect himself, she was bound to be his protector. Yes, she would protect him, though she could dream of a world of joy that might be hers if she could dare to do as he would ask her. He caught her at last and forced her to come out with him into the grounds. He could tell his tale better as he walked by her side than sitting restlessly on a chair or moving awkwardly about the room as on such an occasion he would be sure to do. Within four walls she would have some advantage over him. She could sit still and be dignified in her stillness. But in the open air, when they would both be on their legs, she might not be so powerful with him, and he perhaps might be stronger with her. She could not refuse him when he asked her to walk with him. And why should she refuse him? Of course he must be allowed to utter his prayer, and then she must be allowed to make her answer. "I think the marriage went off very well," he said. "Very well. Everett ought to be a happy man. No doubt he will be, when he settles down to something. Everything will come right for him. With some people things seem to go smooth, don't they? They have not hitherto gone smoothly with you and me, Emily. You are prosperous. You have everything before you that a man can wish, if only you will allow yourself to think so. Your profession is successful, and you are in Parliament, and everyone likes you. It is all nothing. That is the general discontent of the world. It is all nothing, unless I have you too. Remember that I had said so long before I was successful, when I did not dream of Parliament, before we had heard of the name of the man who came between me and my happiness. I think I am entitled to be believed when I say so. I think I know my own mind. There are many men who would have been changed by the episode of such a marriage. You ought to have been changed by it, and by its result. It had no such effect. Here I am, after it all, telling you as I used to tell you before, that I have to look to you for my happiness. You should be ashamed to confess it, Arthur. Never, not to you, nor to all the world. I know what it has been. I know you are not now as you were then. You have been his wife, and are now his widow. That should be enough. But, such as you are, my happiness is in your hands. If it were not so, do you think that all my family as well as yours would join in wishing that you may become my wife? There is nothing to conceal. When you married that man you know what my mother thought of it, and what John thought of it, and his wife. They had wanted you to be my wife. And they want it now, because they are anxious for my happiness. And your father wishes it, and your brother wishes it, because they trust me, and think that I should be a good husband to you. Good, she exclaimed, hardly knowing what she meant by repeating the word. After that you have no right to set yourself up to judge what may be best for my happiness. They who know how to judge are all united. Whatever you may have been, they believe that it will be good for me that you should now be my wife. After that you must talk about me no longer, unless you will talk of my wishes. Do you think I am not anxious for your happiness? I do not know, but I shall find out in time. That is what I have to say about myself. And as to you, is it not much the same? I know you love me. Whatever the feeling was that overcame you as to that other man, it has gone. I cannot now stop to be tender and soft in my words. The thing to be said is too serious to me. And every friend you have wants you to marry the man you love and to put an end to the desolation which you have brought on yourself. There is not one among us all, Fletchers and Whartons, whose comfort does not more or less depend on your sacrificing the luxury of your own woe. Luxury. Yes, luxury. No man ever had a right to say more positively to a woman that it was her duty to marry him, than I have to you. And I do say it. I say it on behalf of all of us, that it is your duty. I won't talk of my own love now, because you know it. You cannot doubt it. I won't even talk of yours, because I am sure of it. But I say that it is your duty to give up drowning us all in tears, burying us in desolation. You are one of us, and should do as all of us wish you. If, indeed, you could not love me it would be different. There. I have said what I've got to say. You are crying, and I will not take your answer now. I will come to you again tomorrow, and then you shall answer me. But, remember when you do so that the happiness of many people depends on what you say. Then he left her very suddenly and hurried back to the house by himself. He had been very rough with her, had not once attempted to touch her hand or even her arm, had spoken no soft word to her, speaking of his own love as a thing too certain to need further words. And he had declared himself to be so assured of her love that there was no favor for him now to ask, nothing for which he was bound to pray as a lover. All that was past. He had simply declared it to be her duty to marry him, and had told her so with much sternness. He had walked fast, compelling her to accompany him, had frowned at her, and had more than once stamped his foot upon the ground. During the whole interview she had been so near to weeping that she could hardly speak. Once or twice she had almost thought him to be cruel. But he had forced her to acknowledge to herself that all that he had said was true and unanswerable. Had he pressed her for an answer at the moment she would not have known in what words to couch a refusal. And yet as she made her way alone back to the house she assured herself that she would have refused. He had given her 24 hours, and at the end of that time she would be bound to give him her answer, an answer which must then be final. And as she said this to herself she found that she was admitting a doubt. She hardly knew how not to doubt, knowing, as she did, that all whom she loved were on one side, while on the other was nothing but the stubbornness of her own convictions. But still the conviction was left to her. Over and over again she declared to herself that it was not fit, meaning thereby to assure herself that a higher duty even than that which she owed to her friends demanded from her that she should be true to her convictions. She met him that day at dinner, but he hardly spoke to her. They sat together in the same room during the evening, but she hardly once heard his voice. It seemed to her that he avoided even looking at her. When they separated for the night he parted from her almost as though they had been strangers. Surely he was angry with her because she was stubborn, thought evil of her because she would not do as others wished her. She lay awake during the long night thinking of it all. If it might be so. Oh, if it might be so. If it might be done without utter ruin to her own self-respect as a woman. In the morning she was down early, not having anything to say, with no clear purpose as yet before her, but still with a feeling that perhaps that morning might alter all things for her. He was the latest of the party, not coming in for prayers as did all the others, but taking his seat when the others had half finished their breakfast. As he sat down he gave a general half-uttered greeting to them all, but spoke no special word to any of them. It chanced that his seat was next to hers, but to her he did not address himself at all. Then the meal was over, and the chairs were withdrawn, and the party grouped itself about with vague, uncertain movements. As men and women do before they leave the breakfast table for the work of the day. She meditated her escape, but felt that she could not leave the room before Lady Wharton or Mrs. Fletcher, who had remained at Wharton to keep her mother company for a while. At last they went. But then, just as she was escaping, he put his hand upon her and reminded her of her appointment. "I shall be in the hall in a quarter of an hour," he said. "Will you meet me there?" Then she bowed her head to him and passed on. She was there at the time named and found him standing by the hall door, waiting for her. His hat was already on his head and his back was almost turned to her. He opened the door, and, allowing her to pass out first, led the way to the shrubbery. He did not speak to her till he had closed behind her the little iron gate which separated the walk from the garden, and then he turned upon her with one word. "Well?" he said. She was silent for a moment, and then he repeated his eager question, "Well, well?" "I should disgrace you," she said, not firmly as before, but whispering the words. He waited for no other assent. The form of the words told him that he had won the day. In a moment his arms were round her, and her veil was off, and his lips were pressed to hers. And when she could see his countenance the whole form of his face was altered to her. It was bright as it used to be bright in old days, and he was smiling on her as he used to smile. "My own," he said, "my wife, my own." And she had no longer the power to deny him. "Not yet, Arthur, not yet," was all that she could say. Chapter 80. The last meeting at Matching. The ex-Prime Minister did not carry out his purpose of leaving London in the middle of the season and travelling either to Italy or Norway. He was away from London at Whitsuntide longer perhaps than he might have been if still in office. And during this period regarded himself as a man from whose hands all work had been taken, as one who had been found unfit to carry any longer a burden serviceably. But before June was over he and the Duchess were back in London. And gradually he allowed himself to open his mouth on this or that subject in the House of Lords, not pitching into everybody all round, as his wife had recommended, but expressing an opinion now and again, generally in support of his friends, with the dignity which should belong to a retired Prime Minister. The Duchess too recovered much of her good temper, as far at least as the outward show went. One or two who knew her, especially Mrs. Finn, were aware that her hatred and her ideas of revenge were not laid aside. But she went on from day to day anathematizing her special enemies and abstained from reproaching her husband for his pusillanimity. Then came the question as to the autumn. "Let's have everybody down at Gatherum, just as we had before," said the Duchess. The proposition almost took away the Duke's breath. "Why do you want a crowd like that?" "Just to show them that we are not beaten because we are turned out." "But, inasmuch as we were turned out, we were beaten." And what has a gathering of people at my private house to do with a political maneuver? Do you especially want to go to Gatherum? I hate the place. You know I do. Then why should you propose to go there? He hardly yet knew his wife well enough to understand that the suggestion had been a joke. If you don't wish to go abroad. I hate going abroad. Then we'll remain at Matching. You don't hate Matching. Ah dear. There are memories there too. But you like it. My books are there. Blue books, said the Duchess. And there is plenty of room if you wish to have friends. I suppose we must have somebody. You can't live without your mentor. You can ask whom you please, he said almost fretfully. Lady Rosina, of course, suggested the Duchess. Then he turned to the papers before him and wouldn't say another word. The matter ended in a party much as usual being collected at Matching about the middle of October, Telemachus having spent the early part of the autumn with Mentor at Long Royston. There might perhaps be a dozen guests in the house, and among them of course were Phineas Finn and his wife. And Mr. Grey was there, having come back from his Eastern mission, whose unfortunate abandonment of his seat at Silverbridge had caused so many troubles, and Mrs. Grey, who in days now long past had been almost as necessary to Lady Glencora as was now her later friend Mrs. Finn, and the Cantrips, and for a short time the St. Bungais. But Lady Rosina de Courcy on this occasion was not present. There were few there whom my patient readers have not seen at Matching before, but among those few was Arthur Fletcher. So it is to be, said the Duchess to the member for Silverbridge one morning. She had by this time become intimate with her member, as she would sometimes call him in joke, and had concerned herself much as to his matrimonial prospects. Yes, Duchess. It is to be, unless some unforeseen circumstance should arise. What circumstance? Ladies and gentlemen sometimes do change their minds, but in this case I do not think it likely. And why ain't you being married now, Mr. Fletcher? We have agreed to postpone it till next year, so that we may be quite sure of our own minds. I know you are laughing at me. But nevertheless I am very glad that it is settled. Pray tell her from me that I shall call again as soon as ever she is Mrs. Fletcher, though I don't think she repaid either of the last 2 visits I made her. You must make excuses for her, Duchess. Of course. I know. After all she is a most fortunate woman. And as for you, I regard you as a hero among lovers. I'm getting used to it, she said one day to Mrs. Finn. Of course you'll get used to it. We get used to anything that chance sends us in a marvelously short time. What I mean is that I can go to bed, and sleep, and get up and eat my meals without missing the sound of the trumpets so much as I did at first. I remember hearing of people who lived in a mill, and couldn't sleep when the mill stopped. It was like that with me when our mill stopped at first. I had got myself so used to the excitement of it, that I could hardly live without it. You might have all the excitement still, if you pleased. You need not be dead to politics because your husband is not Prime Minister. No, never again, unless he should come back. If anyone had told me 10 years ago that I should have taken an interest in this or that man being in the government, I should have laughed him to scorn. It did not seem possible to me then that I should care what became of such men as Sir Timothy Beeswax and Mr. Roby. But I did get to be anxious about it when Plantagenet was shifted from one office to another. Of course you did. Do you think I am not anxious about Phineas? But when he became Prime Minister, I gave myself up to it altogether. I shall never forget what I felt when he came to me and told me that perhaps it might be so. But told me also that he would escape from it if it were possible. I was the Lady Macbeth of the occasion all over, whereas he was so scrupulous, so burdened with conscience. As for me, I would have taken it by any means. Then it was that the old Duke played the part of the 3 witches to a nicety. Well, there hasn't been any absolute murder, and I haven't quite gone mad. Nor need you be afraid, though all the woods of Gatherum should come to Matching. God forbid. I will never see anything of Gatherum again. What annoys me most is, and always was, that he wouldn't understand what I felt about it. How proud I was that he should be Prime Minister, how anxious that he should be great and noble in his office, how I worked for him, and not at all for any pleasure of my own. I think he did feel it. No, not as I did. At last he liked the power, or rather feared the disgrace of losing it. But he had no idea of the personal grandeur of the place. He never understood that to be Prime Minister in England is as much as to be an emperor in France, and much more than being president in America. Oh, how I did labor for him, and how he did scold me for it with those quiet little stinging words of his. I was vulgar. Is that a quiet word? Yes, as he used it. And indiscreet, and ignorant, and stupid. I bore it all, though sometimes I was dying with vexation. Now it's all over, and here we are as humdrum as anyone else. And the beeswaxes, and the Rabbas, and the Droughts, and the Pountneys, and the Lopezes, have all passed over the scene. Do you remember that Pountney affair, and how he turned the poor man out of the house? It served him right. It would have served them all right to be turned out, only they were there for a purpose. I did like it in a way, and it makes me sad to think that the feeling can never come again. Even if they should have him back again, it would be a very lame affair to me then. I can never again rouse myself to the effort of preparing food and lodging for half the Parliament and their wives. I shall never again think that I can help to rule England by coaxing unpleasant men. It is done and gone, and can never come back again. Not long after this the Duke took Mr. Monk, who had come down to Matching for a few days, out to the very spot on which he had sat when he indulged himself in lecturing Phineas Finn on conservatism and liberalism generally. And then asked the Chancellor of the Exchequer what he thought of the present state of public affairs. He himself had supported Mr. Gresham's government, and did not belong to it because he could not at present reconcile himself to filling any office. Mr. Monk did not scruple to say that in his opinion the present legitimate division of parties was preferable to the coalition which had existed for 3 years. In such an arrangement, said Mr. Monk, there must always be a certain amount of distrust, and such a feeling is fatal to any great work. I think I distrusted no one till separation came, and when it did come it was not caused by me. I am not blaming anyone now, said the other. But men who have been brought up with opinions altogether different, even with different instincts as to politics, who from their mother's milk have been nourished on codes of thought altogether opposed to each other, cannot work together with confidence even though they may desire the same thing. The very ideas which are sweet as honey to the one are bitter as gall to the other. You think, then, that we made a great mistake? I will not say that, said Mr. Monk. There was a difficulty at the time, and that difficulty was overcome. The government was carried on, and was on the whole respected. History will give you credit for patriotism, patience, and courage. No man could have done it better than you did, probably no other man of the day so well. But it was not a great part to play? The Duke in his nervousness, as he said this, could not avoid the use of that questioning tone which requires an answer great enough to satisfy the heart of a man who has fortified himself against the evil side of ambition. After all, what is it that the Prime Minister of such a country as this should chiefly regard? Is it not the prosperity of the country? It is not often that we want great measures, or new arrangements that shall be vital to the country. Politicians now look for grievances, not because the grievances are heavy, but trusting that the honor of abolishing them may be great. It is the old story of the needy knife grinder who, if left to himself, would have no grievance of which to complain. But there are grievances, said the Duke. Look at monetary denominations. Look at our weights and measures. Well, yes. I will not say that everything has as yet been reduced to divine order. But when we took office 3 years ago we certainly did not intend to settle those difficulties. No, indeed, said the Duke, sadly. But we did do all that we meant to do. For my own part, there is only one thing in it that I regret, and one only which you should regret also till you have resolved to remedy it. What thing is that? Your own retirement from official life. If the country is to lose your services for the long course of years during which you will probably sit in Parliament, then I shall think that the country has lost more than it has gained by the coalition. The Duke sat for a while silent, looking at the view, and, before answering Mr. Monk, while arranging his answer, once or twice in a half-absent way, called his companion's attention to the scene before him. But during this time he was going through an act of painful repentance. He was condemning himself for a word or two that had been ill-spoken by himself, and which, since the moment of its utterance, he had never ceased to remember with shame. He told himself now, after his own secret fashion, that he must do penance for these words by the humiliation of a direct contradiction of them. He must declare that Caesar would at some future time be prepared to serve under Pompey. Then he made his answer. Mr. Monk, he said, I should be false if I were to deny that it pleases me to hear you say so. I have thought much of all that for the last 2 or 3 months. You may probably have seen that I am not a man endowed with that fortitude which enables many to bear vexations with an easy spirit. I am given to fretting, and I am inclined to think that a popular minister in a free country should be so constituted as to be free from that infirmity. I shall certainly never desire to be at the head of a government again. For a few years I would prefer to remain out of office. But I will endeavor to look forward to a time when I may again perhaps be of some humble use.